A thin veil of fog rises from the rivers of America, curling around twisted roots and jagged banks as if the water itself conceals secrets too deep to surface. From the shadowed backwaters of the Mississippi to the hidden bends of the Susquehanna, ordinary waterways have witnessed sudden, violent attacks that defy explanation. Over decades, eyewitnesses have described strange currents, invisible forces, and abrupt assaults that leave no trace, challenging both science and common understanding. As you move along these mist-laden shores, imagine the chill of the morning air and the unsettling hush that follows each untraceable strike. You will explore the locations where victims vanished or were discovered in states of unexplained trauma, encounter documented eyewitness accounts, and examine the physical anomalies these rivers conceal. Each river tells its own story, violent, enigmatic, and impossible to forget, revealing the unsettling reality that danger often lurks where we least expect it. The Matawan Creek Predator. The creek that cut through Matawan, New Jersey, in the summer of 1916 was narrow, tidal, and bordered by marsh grass and low wooden docks, a place locals considered harmless enough for children to swim in during the heat of July. Yet it was here, far inland from the Atlantic Ocean, that one of the most unsettling river attacks in American history unfolded, leaving behind a pattern of violence that resisted simple explanation. Unlike the open sea, Matawan Creek offered no obvious space for large predators to move unseen, and its calm surface gave little warning of danger beneath. What occurred along its banks challenged assumptions about where threats could exist and how they might travel. At the time, the region was already unsettled by reports of shark attacks along the New Jersey coast, beginning with the death of Charles Van Son at Beach Haven on July 1, 1916, followed by a fatal attack on Charles Bruder in Spring Lake 5 days later. These incidents drew national attention, but they remained tied to the ocean, where such dangers, however rare, could be imagined. Matawan Creek lay roughly 11 miles inland, connected to Raritan Bay through a winding tidal channel whose shallow depth and fluctuating salinity seemed unsuitable for large marine animals. This geographic separation became central to the mystery once violence erupted far from the shoreline. On July 12, 1916, a group of local boys swam near Wyckoff Dock, a familiar spot along Matawan Creek, where the water moved slowly between reeds and pilings. 13-year-old Lester Stillwell was among them when he suddenly cried out and vanished beneath the surface. Witnesses initially believed he had suffered a cramp or had been pulled under by the current, but the frantic splashing that followed suggested something far more forceful. Moments later, blood appeared in the water, spreading quickly across the narrow channel, transforming a quiet afternoon swim into a scene of confusion and fear. Stanley Fisher, a 24-year-old tailor from New York who was visiting the area, rushed into the creek in an attempt to rescue the boy. Fisher had not seen an animal, nor did he believe one was present, but he was driven by the urgency of the moment rather than caution. As he reached the area where Stillwell disappeared, Fisher was attacked with sudden violence, suffering massive injuries to his right thigh. He managed to stagger back to shore but collapsed shortly afterward, dying later that day from blood loss. Stillwell's body was recovered downstream 2 days later, bearing clear signs of a severe attack. The physical evidence raised immediate questions. Stillwell's remains showed extensive trauma to the legs and torso, injuries that physicians at the time described as consistent with a powerful bite rather than drowning or collision with debris. Fisher's wounds were similarly severe, involving deep lacerations that severed major arteries. These details were documented in contemporary medical reports and newspaper accounts, lending weight to the claim that both victims had been attacked by something capable of exerting immense force in confined, shallow water. Yet no one had seen a definitive attacker, and the creek itself offered few clues. Adding to the unease were reports from residents who claimed they had seen a large, dark shape moving through the creek earlier that day. Some described it as resembling a shark's dorsal fin cutting through the surface, while others believed it was a large fish or unknown animal navigating the tidal flow. These accounts were inconsistent, but they shared a common theme. Whatever was present did not belong in a narrow freshwater creek bordered by mud banks and overhanging vegetation. The idea that such a creature could enter, survive, and attack in this environment unsettled even seasoned observers, The question of how an ocean predator could reach Matawan Creek became central to subsequent investigations. The creek connects to Raritan Bay through a series of bends and shallow stretches, some only a few feet deep at low tide. Modern researchers have noted that certain shark species, particularly bull sharks, are capable of tolerating fresh water and have been documented travelling far upriver in other parts of the world. However, in 1916 this knowledge was limited, and no confirmed records existed of sharks entering New Jersey rivers. The possibility remained theoretical rather than proven. Efforts to capture or kill the suspected predator intensified after the attacks. Local fishermen and townspeople set traps, dropped nets, and even used dynamite in the creek in hopes of eliminating the threat. One large shark was later caught in Raritan Bay by Michael Schleiser, a taxidermist from New York, and its stomach contents reportedly included human remains, though documentation of this claim remains incomplete. While this capture eased public fear, it did not conclusively explain the Matawan attacks, particularly given the distance and conditions involved. Some scientists and historians have proposed alternative explanations over the years, including the possibility of a large sturgeon or other aggressive fish native to the region. Atlantic sturgeon can reach considerable size and were present in New Jersey waters at the time, though their feeding behaviour does not typically involve violent attacks on humans. Others have suggested that panic, confusion, and overlapping injuries may have shaped witness accounts. Still, the documented wounds, combined with the sequence of events, resist easy reinterpretation. The attacks also occurred during an exceptional heatwave, which drew more people into rivers and streams that summer, and may have altered animal behaviour due to changing water temperatures and salinity. Matawan Creek, influenced by tidal flow, could briefly mimic brackish conditions favourable to certain marine species. These environmental factors are verifiable and offer context, but they do not fully resolve how an unseen predator could strike twice in rapid succession without being clearly identified or stopped. In the aftermath, Matawan installed warning signs along the creek, and swimming was temporarily banned. Over time, the events faded into local lore, often overshadowed by the broader 1916 shark panic along the coast. Yet the creek attacks remain distinct in their setting and implications, suggesting a breach of boundaries that people believed were secure. Rivers were supposed to be safer than oceans, more familiar, and less hostile, a belief that Matawan Creek quietly dismantled. More than a century later, the Matawan Creek predator continues to occupy an uneasy space between explanation and uncertainty. While modern science leans toward the likelihood of a bull shark navigating inland waters, definitive proof remains absent, and no single piece of evidence fully reconstructs what happened beneath the surface that afternoon. The creek still winds through Monmouth County, narrow and unassuming, carrying with it the memory of an attack that occurred where danger was never expected to reach. And even now, the slow-moving water of Matawan Creek gives no sign of what once passed through it, or whether something capable of crossing that invisible line between ocean and river might still do so again. The Ohio River Butcher Incident. Freight barges, lock gates, and long industrial bends define the Ohio River, a waterway so large that individual moments are easily swallowed by its constant movement. Stretching more than 900 miles from Pittsburgh to Cairo, Illinois, the river passes through working cities and quiet towns alike, carrying coal, grain, and steel past concrete embankments and eroded banks. It is a river built for transport rather than reflection, and its scale has long encouraged the assumption that whatever happens along it will eventually be absorbed and forgotten. It was along this vast corridor that an unexplainable attack came to light, not as a witnessed act of violence, but as a troubling aftermath discovered too late for certainty. The incident did not announce itself with splashing or cries for help, but instead emerged later through a discovery along the river's edge that immediately troubled investigators. The victim was found near the waterline, positioned in a way that suggested contact with the river, but not a simple fall or accident. There were no signs of a struggle on the surrounding ground, no overturned equipment, and no witnesses who could say when the attack had occurred. What little context existed came from the river itself, whose constant motion erased any clear boundary between where the violence began and where it ended. Medical examiners focused less on where the body had been found than on how the injuries themselves resisted any single, familiar explanation. The trauma showed evidence of extreme force applied in a controlled manner, with damage patterns that did not align cleanly with drowning, collision, or prolonged submersion. Some wounds appeared localized and deliberate, while others suggested crushing pressure inconsistent with common river accidents. These observations were carefully documented, yet they raised more questions than answers, as none pointed conclusively toward a known animal, mechanical source, or environmental hazard. Currents, submerged debris, and commercial traffic are often blamed for river injuries, yet none of these hazards aligned cleanly with the specific trauma observed. Propeller strikes typically leave distinctive patterns, while encounters with debris tend to produce irregular blunt injuries rather than concentrated damage. Even powerful currents, which can pin or trap a person underwater, rarely result in the kind of focused wounds noted in this case. The Ohio River is dangerous, but its dangers are usually well understood, making this deviation from expectation particularly unsettling. After sunset, the Ohio River transforms into a corridor of mechanical noise and shadow, where visibility collapses and distance becomes difficult to judge. Navigation lights from barges flicker across the surface, and the hum of engines blends with the sound of water moving against steel and stone. In these conditions, a person near the river can vanish from view without immediate notice, especially along industrial stretches where public access is limited. This nocturnal environment offered opportunity, but it also complicated every attempt to reconstruct what might have happened. Reconstructing the victim's final hours proved difficult, as confirmed sightings dissolved into estimates and gaps that could not be closed with certainty. Investigators relied on partial timelines built from routine movements and indirect observations, none of which established a precise moment of danger. The river's role in these missing hours remained ambiguous, acting both as a setting and a potential participant. Without a clear sequence of events, even basic questions about location and timing remained unresolved. Early theories surfaced quickly, offered as reassurance as much as explanation, but each unraveled when matched against the physical evidence. Accidental injury was considered, then dismissed due to the nature of the wounds. Animal attack entered the discussion, yet no known Ohio River species could reasonably account for the injuries as documented. Mechanical causes were examined as well, but no vessel damage or operational reports supported such a conclusion, leaving investigators without a theory that fully held together. The river's slow surface current disguises a complex system of undertows and shifting channels capable of relocating objects without leaving obvious traces. Seasonal changes, dam releases, and vessel traffic constantly alter the river's behaviour, making it difficult to predict how evidence might travel or disappear. Items introduced into the water can move significant distances without surfacing, and points of entry are rarely preserved. This physical reality allowed the river to obscure crucial details without revealing whether it was merely concealing evidence or had played a more active role. Jurisdiction along the Ohio River further complicated the investigation in ways rarely visible to the public. Unlike most rivers, the Ohio is legally owned by the states along its northern bank, meaning authority can shift abruptly depending on which side of the channel an incident is believed to have occurred. This fragmented oversight affected how evidence was handled, which agencies took lead responsibility, and how information was shared. In cases where the precise location of an attack could not be established, this legal ambiguity slowed coordination and limited follow-up, quietly allowing unanswered questions to drift into administrative limbo. While the case stood alone in official records, it echoed uneasily alongside other poorly explained injuries reported along the same stretch of river. These incidents were not formally linked, yet they contributed to a quiet undercurrent of concern among those who worked near the water. River workers and residents understood that the Ohio could be dangerous, but they also recognized when something did not fit familiar patterns. Such informal observations never became proof, but they added weight to the sense that this attack was not easily dismissed. No witness ever described an attacker, no tool was recovered, and no environmental factor could be conclusively tied to the violence. The absence of these elements narrowed investigative options rather than expanding them, forcing officials to rely almost entirely on negative space in the evidence. What was missing became as significant as what remained, and the lack of confirmation prevented any definitive conclusion. In a river that supports constant human activity, this silence felt especially pronounced. Eventually, the investigation narrowed not toward an answer, but toward a classification that allowed the case to be set aside without being solved. This administrative resolution acknowledged uncertainty without resolving it, preserving the documented facts while leaving interpretation open. The file could be closed, but the underlying questions remained untouched, suspended between official restraint and unresolved suspicion. For the river, operations continued as usual, indifferent to the uncertainty it carried. What remains most unsettling is not what authorities concluded, but what the documented evidence still quietly refuses to explain. The injuries did not evolve into legend or exaggeration. They stayed fixed in reports and photographs, unchanged by time. Each review returned investigators to the same impasse, where known dangers failed to account for what had occurred. The Ohio River, immense and unremarkable in its daily passage, offered no clarification then and has offered none since. Somewhere between the river's shifting currents and its unrecorded hours, the truth of what happened was carried away, leaving behind only injuries that never fully made sense. Terror at the Potomac Flats. A sudden commotion in the water drew the attention of bystanders, but no one could say what had struck first or why it moved with such force. Families picnicking along the muddy flats paused, and the sound of splashing cut across the otherwise quiet afternoon. For a brief moment, the river seemed alive in a way that contradicted its shallow, exposed appearance. People leaned forward instinctively, trying to glimpse the source, but the water offered no answers, only ripples and shifting reflections that hinted at something moving beneath the surface, something that should not have been there. Children on the riverbank froze mid-step, and adults leaned forward instinctively, their instinctive curiosity colliding with fear they could not name. Parents clutched younger children while others whispered to each other, trying to rationalize the sudden disturbance. Even experienced swimmers hesitated, eyeing the shallow mudflats as though the water itself might strike again. The flats had always seemed tame, a place for wading and shallow swimming, yet in that moment it became unknowable, unpredictable and deeply threatening despite its familiarity. Voices called out contradictory descriptions. Some claimed a shadow beneath the shallow surface, others swore they had seen nothing at all. Attempts to reconcile the accounts failed immediately, each observer's perspective conflicted with the next. Some recalled a sudden dark shape darting close to the victim, others only remembered ripples spreading outward, unaccompanied by a sound. Even in daylight with dozens of people present, perception fractured, leaving only partial truths that would form the foundation of confusion for the following investigation. A swimmer emerged moments later with deep, precise lacerations, and rescuers struggled to reconcile the severity of the wounds with the calm depth of the flats. Medical personnel quickly assessed the injuries, noting that the cuts were concentrated and forceful, suggesting a striking or slicing mechanism rather than incidental scraping against rocks or debris. The apparent precision of the trauma defied the shallow water context, leaving responders unsure whether they were dealing with a natural attack, a mechanical hazard, or something entirely anomalous. Paramedics and medical staff noted unusual patterns in the injuries that did not match known aquatic accidents or common predator behavior in the river. While Potomac wildlife includes snapping turtles, catfish, and occasional otters, none are capable of inflicting trauma of this severity in water barely 3 feet deep. Emergency responders documented everything carefully, yet their notes carried a tone of quiet incredulity. The human body had been damaged in ways no familiar force could account for, within conditions that should have prevented it entirely. River specialists quickly ruled out all native species as capable of inflicting such targeted trauma in water so shallow and exposed. Biologists consulted historical records and current surveys, emphasizing that known predators avoid open, human-populated flats during the day. They noted that the river's salt content, temperature and flow at this particular section were unsuitable for large or aggressive aquatic animals. Even under the most extreme assumptions, no wildlife explanation could fully account for the injuries sustained or the suddenness of the attack. Rescuers found themselves unexpectedly challenged by the flats themselves, where shifting mud and hidden channels turned every step into a risk. Attempts to approach the injured swimmer required careful balance on treacherous mudflats, and even the strongest responders sank into the soft sediment unexpectedly. Every movement disturbed water and debris, washing away footprints and any potential clues. Handfuls of mud clung to equipment, making the act of assistance laborious and imprecise. In a river that seemed so calm and controlled, the flats revealed a subtle hostility of their own, as if the terrain itself conspired to keep the attack partially hidden from human understanding. Observers realized that even minor tidal shifts could have masked the movement of an attacker, carrying it briefly out of sight in ways that seemed impossible for a person. Brackish water conditions combined with subtle currents might have allowed something to remain hidden momentarily, creating the impression of an instantaneous strike. However, tidal records and depth measurements showed that the water remained largely transparent and shallow at the time, further complicating attempts to explain how the assault occurred unseen and why the disturbance had been so brief yet effective. Patrol boats arrived minutes after the initial incident, yet by then whatever had caused the attack had left no visible trace, leaving officers grasping at thin explanations. Federal and local personnel combed the area with spotlights and shallow nets, yet neither equipment nor human presence revealed a culprit. Reports documented only the victim, disturbed water, and fragments of mud that had been displaced during the struggle. Despite constant oversight and proximity to authorities, the river had offered no clues, as if the act itself had briefly intersected with the flats and then disappeared entirely. Crowds gathered at the riverbank, whispers spreading faster than the water itself, yet despite the number of witnesses, clarity never emerged. Speculation ran from mistaken observation to fear of unknown predators, but nothing could reconcile the witnesses' certainty of what had occurred with the lack of physical evidence. Observers noted that while many aspects of the river seemed mundane and familiar, the moment of violence left an impression that lingered far longer than the ripples themselves. Historical records of the flats show scattered minor incidents where people reported sudden disturbances in shallow water, though none approached the severity of this attack. Previous cases included abrupt slips, unexplained bruising, and near misses that local newspapers documented in brief notices. While these events were dismissed at the time as accidents or natural misfortune, they hint at a recurring pattern of anomalous occurrences in the same stretch of river. This context deepened the sense that the flats could harbour hidden dangers, amplifying the mystery of the recent, more serious attack and the inability to reconcile it with ordinary river hazards. Investigators combed the flats carefully but found no tool, no discarded object, and no sign of how the assault had been carried out. Search teams returned day after day, expanding their radius, measuring the mud, cataloguing footprints, and even checking for small submerged hazards. Nothing explained the precise mechanism of injury, nor was there evidence of repeated attack. The river had erased or concealed whatever had caused the trauma, leaving behind an unsettling combination of fact and absence. Statements issued to newspapers avoided speculation, focusing instead on the facts of the injuries and the impossibility of explaining the event definitively. Editors quoted local authorities noting that no known species or mechanical cause could account for the damage observed, and the story circulated widely as a cautionary note rather than a resolved incident. Yet for those present at the flats that day, the reports never captured the unease of standing on the muddy edge, knowing that something had happened before their eyes and gone unexplained. Even after interviews, patrol reports, and forensic assessments, the attack resisted categorization, leaving everyone involved unsettled and watchful. Scholars reviewing the case decades later emphasized the limits of daytime observation and the surprising impact that small environmental factors can have on human perception. The Potomac Flats, despite their exposure and oversight, demonstrated that even well-observed locations can host moments of inexplicable violence that defy simple categorization, lingering quietly in official records and local memory alike. In a river so exposed to human eyes, the moment of violence remained invisible, its method and motive concealed in plain sight. The Gila River Night Assault. Moonlight barely touched the surface of the Gila River, and a sudden, violent splash broke the silence, immediately drawing attention to something moving unseen beneath the water. The river's usual quiet had lulled those camping nearby into complacency, yet the sound was sharp and irregular, as if something large had struck with intent. Reflections of the stars trembled across the current, concealing any detail of what had caused the disturbance, while the surrounding desert seemed to press inward, amplifying the sound in the emptiness of the night. No one could tell if the movement was animal, human, or something entirely unknown. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the riverbank as those nearby struggled to make sense of motion in the faint illumination, their senses heightened by the unfamiliar stillness of the night. Every snapping twig and rustling of reeds became a potential threat. Campers whispered urgently to one another, voices strained and cautious. Even those accustomed to the desert at night felt the unease settle deep into their bones, a creeping realization that the river was no longer a predictable element in the landscape, but a conduit for something they could neither see nor understand. Moments later, a lone figure stumbled from the shallow channel, water dripping from torn clothing, leaving witnesses uncertain whether what they had seen was natural or deliberate. Fear and adrenaline caused fragmented reporting. Some said the person appeared to have been attacked. Others insisted the injuries were self-inflicted or accidental. The victim's expressions, half hidden in darkness, conveyed shock that even the most experienced observers struggled to interpret. In that moment, the Gila River transformed from a quiet night scene into an uncharted space of danger and uncertainty. Medical responders quickly noted that the wounds were deep, precise, and seemingly selective, inconsistent with typical river accidents or encounters with known aquatic animals. Cuts and bruises appeared in patterns that suggested intention, with clean edges and concentrated placement. The victim's clothing showed signs of tearing consistent with a struggle, yet no foreign objects or natural hazards could explain the injuries. Emergency personnel documented every detail meticulously, aware that the darkness of night amplified both the difficulty and the mystery of their task. Biologists familiar with the Gila River's nocturnal inhabitants confirmed that native species, ranging from catfish to small reptiles, could not account for the speed, precision, or severity of the injuries. No known animal in the region attacks with such focused intent, particularly in shallow, moonlit water. Experts emphasized that while nocturnal wildlife might create disturbances in the current, the trauma observed was incompatible with natural predation. Scientific observations only deepened the puzzle. The assault defied both logic and experience. Submerged rocks, sudden drop-offs, and treacherous currents complicated the scene, creating plausible dangers while simultaneously obscuring the true cause of the assault. Sandbars shifted underfoot, and small channels redirected the flow unpredictably, making even a cautious approach difficult. Rescuers and investigators alike found that the physical environment could hide movement without fully explaining the sudden, precise nature of the injuries. The river itself, seemingly inert, had transformed into a labyrinth of hidden hazards, blurring the line between accident and attack. The river behaved differently under the cover of darkness, with sudden chill and shifting currents masking any movement beneath its surface. Observers noted that subtle eddies seemed to appear and disappear unpredictably, altering the way sounds travelled across the water. Every ripple, every splash became both evidence and illusion, as though the night itself played tricks on perception. These subtle factors made it impossible to reconstruct the event with certainty and contributed to a growing awareness that the Gila River at night had its own concealed logic. The darkness distorted perception, making every ripple and whisper of wind sound like a threat, intensifying the tension among those who dared approach the river. Hearts raced with each indistinct sound. The imagination began filling in details that could not be seen. Witnesses described the water seeming to move with a will of its own, while distant shadows danced in and out of sight. In such a setting, the ordinary became extraordinary, and the human mind struggled to separate reality from instinctual fear. Rescue teams arrived with flashlights and minimal equipment, navigating mud banks and uneven terrain as they attempted to locate the source of the attack, yet found only fleeting disturbances in the water. The interplay of moonlight and shadow obscured the riverbed, making each step tentative. Efforts to trace the attacker or even understand the mechanics of the assault proved fruitless. The physical environment and the limitations of nighttime visibility conspired to hide whatever had struck, leaving responders both frustrated and wary. Historical records and local accounts mention the Gila River as unpredictable after dark, with sudden accidents and unusual disturbances noted by early settlers and river guides. Minor injuries, unexpected slips, and fleeting disturbances were often recorded in passing, usually dismissed as accidents or human error. Yet when revisited in light of the recent attack, these scattered references suggested that the river had a long history of anomalous nighttime activity. Though none matched the severity of this assault, the context added depth to the mystery and a subtle warning about what might lurk unseen. Few people had been present along the banks, and those who witnessed the event offered fragmented, often contradictory accounts, further clouding understanding of what had occurred. One observer claimed to see a dark shape retreating into the river. Another insisted the water had erupted with no visible source. Conflicting recollections underscored the impossibility of reconstructing the event from memory alone. The night magnified uncertainty, and the Gila River seemed to resist human attempts at comprehension. Despite careful examination of the riverbed, surrounding banks, and the victims' injuries, investigators uncovered no evidence that definitively explained how the attack had taken place under cover of darkness. Forensic experts documented every mark, every ripple pattern, and even the sediment displacement around the riverbed, yet no conclusion emerged. Nighttime conditions had concealed whatever perpetrated the assault, leaving behind an intricate puzzle of fact and absence. The deeper the investigation went, the more the attack seemed impervious to conventional explanation. The Gila River resumed its quiet, nocturnal rhythm as if nothing had occurred, leaving behind a sense of unease and unanswered questions that would linger in the memories of those involved. Observers returned to their camps, recounting the events in whispers, while investigators reviewed their notes under dim lantern light. The river, now still and reflective, appeared ordinary again, yet the knowledge that an unexplainable incident had just occurred persisted in the minds of all who had witnessed or investigated it. In the pitch-black stillness of the river, whatever had struck remained invisible, its method and presence concealed in shadows where human eyes could not follow. Blood in the Trinity River Bend. At the sharp curve of the Trinity River, water churned unusually, and a sudden, unexplained commotion in the current drew the attention of early morning fishermen. The bend itself created a shadowed stretch where the river deepened unexpectedly, making it difficult to see below the surface. Observers reported erratic splashes and disturbed reeds, as if something moved with intention beneath the water. Those present could not determine whether the cause was animal, human, or entirely unknown, and the uncertainty immediately heightened a sense of unease that lingered along the riverbank. Sediment patterns and the natural bend created blind spots where the water slowed and deepened, concealing movement that would be obvious elsewhere along the river. Small whirlpools formed near the banks, swirling debris and distorting reflections of sunlight on the current. Sandbars and submerged tree roots complicated the flow, producing irregular eddies that could hide rapid movement beneath the surface. Experts later noted that these natural features made the bend particularly challenging for both navigation and observation, effectively masking any unusual activity in the river itself. A canoeist navigating the bend first noticed floating debris and signs of struggle along the shoreline, yet no clear culprit or cause was visible in the turbulent water. Splintered vegetation and torn pieces of clothing drifted along the current, suggesting sudden, forceful contact. The observer described a fleeting glimpse of something dark beneath the surface, but the river's murk and the angle of the bend prevented a clear view. That small encounter was the earliest confirmation that an unexplainable attack had taken place, leaving questions about timing, method, and motive unanswered. Examination revealed precise, penetrating wounds inconsistent with accidental falls or collisions with submerged rocks, baffling investigators and medical personnel alike. Cuts were clean, concentrated on specific areas of the body, and seemed almost deliberate in placement. Bruising patterns suggested struggle, yet no blunt force trauma from ordinary river hazards was present. Emergency responders documented each injury meticulously, noting how the current and uneven riverbed might have complicated natural movement, but nothing in the physical environment could fully account for the nature of the trauma. River biologists confirmed that native species, from catfish to river otters, could not account for the pattern or severity of the injuries observed, leaving the cause deeply puzzling. The largest known aquatic predators in the region lacked the speed, power, or behavior to inflict such damage. Even scavengers would leave irregular marks rather than the clean incisions noted by investigators. The natural fauna of the Trinity River could explain disturbances in water or minor scratches, but nothing matched the exacting precision of the observed attack. Steep banks and hidden eddies made both approach and observation treacherous, creating a natural concealment for whatever had enacted the assault. investigators found sections of the riverbank accessible only by wading or specialised equipment, with submerged routes and sudden drop-offs complicating any attempt at rescue or inspection. The river's topography, combined with its bends and turbulent currents, created conditions where movement could go unseen, contributing to the difficulty of understanding what had occurred. Under closer inspection, investigators noticed unusual sediment patterns along the bend that did not align with typical seasonal shifts. Small depressions in the riverbed suggested rapid, forceful movement of objects or bodies, yet there were no signs of a large animal or mechanical intervention. Water temperature measurements indicated slight but abrupt variations in microcurrents, enough to create unpredictable turbulence in localized spots. Even the alignment of submerged branches and rocks appeared slightly displaced, as though something had passed with deliberate force. These subtle hydrological clues hinted at a violent encounter that remained invisible to casual observers, adding another layer of mystery to the attack. Under the glare of midday sun, the Trinity River seemed ordinary, yet subtle variations in current and sediment had a way of masking abrupt motion, creating distortions that made even the most obvious clues vanish. Tiny whirlpools and shifting eddies could give the illusion of activity where none existed, while the placement of rocks and sandbars distorted both sound and sight. Investigators noted that these environmental subtleties made it nearly impossible to determine the source or timing of the assault, and that the river itself appeared almost to conspire in hiding what had occurred. Even seasoned river guides admitted that the bend defied expectation, transforming normal currents into deceptive flows that challenged both experience and instinct. What appeared as calm stretches could conceal abrupt drops or hidden debris, while the river's curves distorted perception of distance and speed. Witnesses often underestimated the complexity of the water's movement, and that misjudgment may have contributed to the inability to anticipate or explain the attack. Archival reports and early settler accounts hinted at unusual disturbances in this bend of the Trinity River, often minor and unexplained, but now eerily resonant with the present event. Historical documents describe sudden accidents, floating debris appearing without cause, and occasional injuries that could not be attributed to predictable hazards. While these reports were previously dismissed as anomalies, they suggest a long-standing pattern of inexplicable activity that seems concentrated at this particular curve of the river. Attempts to map the incident using modern techniques faltered due to the river's irregular currents and sediment displacement, leaving authorities without a clear reconstruction. Forensic mapping, drone observation, and underwater inspection revealed little beyond normal environmental variability. Every theory, from strong eddies to accidental entanglement, fell short of explaining the precision of the observed injuries. Investigators were left with physical traces that hinted at movement yet concealed the source completely. Scattered footprints, waterborne debris, and subtle disturbances in the riverbed hinted at motion, yet none pointed definitively to a perpetrator or mechanism for the attack. Observers struggled to connect these fragments into a coherent narrative, as each clue could be explained by natural river behaviour, human activity, or random chance. The accumulation of evidence was tantalising yet frustratingly inconclusive, reinforcing the sense that the bend itself was an active participant in hiding the truth. Hydrologists and forensic experts proposed plausible theories, from sudden eddies to unknown aquatic predators, but each hypothesis fell short of fully explaining the precise trauma. Every scientific explanation raised as many questions as it answered, highlighting the limits of knowledge when nature and mystery intersect. Even after a detailed study, no model could replicate the injuries or account for the precise timing and location of the assault, leaving the incident unresolved. By evening, the bend lay calm once more, its waters reflecting the sky, yet the unanswered questions about what had struck remained as sharp as the river's own hidden turns. The calm was deceptive, masking the violent turbulence that had occurred just hours before. Those who observed or investigated the incident departed with a lingering sense of unease, aware that the river could conceal more than it revealed, and that the bend's secrets remained intact. In the deep curve of the Trinity River, the current held secrets that no eye could follow and no explanation could reach. The Mississippi backwater encounter. Mist clung to the slow-moving waters of the Mississippi backwater, and a sudden, inexplicable splash among the reeds suggested something violent had erupted beneath the surface. The river appeared calm from a distance, yet the tangles of submerged vegetation and shifting mud concealed any motion that was not immediately visible. Early morning fog blurred the line between land and water, and the occasional croak of bullfrogs punctuated the uneasy stillness. Locals who navigated these waterways regularly described moments like this as disorienting, where even the smallest ripple could hint at something unseen beneath the opaque surface. Muddy banks sloped sharply into submerged channels, and fallen trees created natural barriers that distorted both sound and sight along the winding backwater paths. Water pooled in irregular depressions, forming microeddies that could briefly trap floating debris or even small animals. Branches, bent and broken by currents or storms, projected above and below the waterline, casting irregular shadows that made it difficult to discern depth or movement. The backwater's irregularity created an environment where natural behaviour of the river could mimic sudden violence, further complicating any attempt to understand what had occurred. A local fisherman noticed torn vegetation and floating debris drifting unnaturally with the current, as though the river itself had been unsettled by a force unseen. Pieces of bark and reeds appeared ripped from their roots, drifting haphazardly while small air bubbles rose from deep below the surface. The observer later described an impression of something moving too fast and too forcefully for any known creature or casual human activity. Nothing in the immediate surroundings could explain the disturbance, yet the evidence indicated a sudden, deliberate encounter had taken place in these shallow, winding waters. Biologists cataloguing the area confirmed that none of the region's typical aquatic species could account for the injuries or disruption observed, leaving the cause deeply perplexing. Alligators, while present, were mostly territorial and avoided human activity, leaving little likelihood of opportunistic attacks of this nature. Fish and turtles did not possess the size or power to inflict the precise disruption recorded, and birds rarely interacted with the water surface with the kind of force that would explain displaced vegetation. The known fauna could explain minor ripples or scattered debris, but the evidence pointed toward an entirely unaccountable event. Navigating through dense reeds and hidden snags, humans were forced into slow, cautious movement, exposing them to dangers that seemed amplified in the maze-like waterways. Even experienced boaters described feeling a creeping unease as they moved past sharp turns and pockets of brackish water where visibility dropped to a few inches. Submerged branches and sudden depth changes could trap paddles or propel small craft off course, creating a natural environment where accidents were common, but none matched the precise sudden disturbances documented that morning. The river's labyrinthine channels magnified uncertainty at every turn. Steep banks and hidden eddies made both approach and observation treacherous, creating a natural concealment for whatever had enacted the assault. Investigators found sections of the bank accessible only by wading carefully through mud, and underwater snags prevented safe movement in several stretches. Small islands of reeds and submerged logs disrupted sound and reflected it irregularly, making it nearly impossible to track movement by noise. The river's natural defences concealed more than just human approach. They also obscured the traces of what had occurred, leaving investigators frustrated at every turn. Under closer inspection, investigators noticed unusual sediment patterns along the backwater that did not align with typical seasonal shifts. Small depressions in the riverbed suggested rapid, forceful movement of objects or bodies, yet there were no signs of a large animal or mechanical intervention. Water temperature measurements indicated slight but abrupt variations in microcurrents, enough to create unpredictable turbulence in localized spots. Even the alignment of submerged branches and roots appeared slightly displaced, as though something had passed with deliberate force. These subtle clues hinted at a violent encounter that remained invisible to casual observers, adding another layer of mystery to the attack. Among the tangles of water plants, investigators found evidence of struggle. Clothing shredded, branches displaced, and subtle marks on the mud indicating rapid motion. Nothing about the scene suggested prolonged contact or struggle, yet the precise pattern and placement of these clues indicated an almost instantaneous force. The ephemeral nature of water and vegetation meant that evidence could disappear within hours, emphasizing the fleeting window investigators had to reconstruct the events. It became apparent that the river itself was an accomplice in concealing whatever had occurred. Old river logs and anecdotal accounts from long-time residents hinted at previous minor disturbances in these backwaters, suggesting the bend held a history of unexplainable incidents. Records described sudden slips, missing equipment, or unexplained injuries in similar isolated stretches of the river, often dismissed as accidents or exaggeration. While these instances were minor and lacked corroborating physical evidence, they provided context for the unusual behaviour observed at this bend. The pattern hinted that this stretch of the Mississippi had a long-standing tendency toward enigmatic disturbances, a subtle history of which few were aware. Forensic teams struggled to map the area due to opaque water and shifting sediment, making reconstruction nearly impossible and leaving the incident shrouded in uncertainty. Drones could capture only the surface, while sonar revealed confusing patterns of debris, roots, and mud shifts. Attempts to simulate currents and movement were confounded by the backwater's irregularities, reinforcing the sense that the environment itself was actively masking what had occurred. Scientists documented all findings meticulously, yet no model could replicate the precision of the evidence left behind. Ripples and displaced reeds hinted at motion too sudden to be natural, while subtle temperature variations in the water indicated currents moving faster than expected in isolated pockets. Each environmental anomaly suggested an interaction between something unseen and the backwater itself, yet none provided a definitive answer. Observers noted that even a minor shift in water temperature or sediment could obscure a trail, meaning that what little could be measured or interpreted might be misleading. The combination of rapid movement and concealment challenged both scientific and intuitive understanding. Even experienced river guides acknowledged that the backwater's labyrinthine channels and sudden depth changes rendered observation unreliable, emphasizing the isolation and unpredictability of the area. Paddlers and surveyors alike described the eerie sensation of moving through a place where the river seemed alive, shifting in ways imperceptible until it was too late. The area's isolation meant that any unusual event could remain hidden for hours or days, its traces dissolved or scattered by the river's natural activity. Mystery persisted not from lack of effort, but from the river's very design. As evening fell, the water's surface smoothed into deceptive calm, masking the chaotic traces of violence beneath that no one could fully decipher. Shadows lengthened across the reeds, and the humid air carried the faint scent of disturbed mud and vegetation. No sound broke the stillness, yet the evidence lingered in subtle disturbances and the uneasy recollections of those who had witnessed the aftermath. The river seemed patient, as though waiting for the next observer to stumble upon what it would reveal, or conceal. In the quiet, shadowed backwaters of the Mississippi, the river seemed to withhold its secrets as deliberately as it concealed its depths. The Susquehanna River dragging. The Susquehanna River stretched in muted currents beneath an overcast sky, its surface suddenly roiled by a violent and unexplained force. Small waves radiated outward from an invisible centre, as though something beneath had erupted with deliberate intent. Locals who navigated this stretch described a momentary impression of the river as a living entity, capable of sudden and unaccountable movement. Even seasoned observers struggled to reconcile the sudden chaos with the river's typically placid demeanour, leaving only questions about the unseen agent behind it. A canoeist navigating the narrow channel froze as the water erupted in a jagged swirl, accompanied by a snapping sound that seemed impossible to place. Paddle strokes faltered as the vessel rocked unexpectedly, and the suddenness of the event left him momentarily disoriented. He later recounted that nothing he saw resembled ordinary wildlife activity or driftwood moving in the current. The chaos of movement occurred too quickly for the eye to follow, leaving only a lingering sense of something unseen yet violently present. Underwater ridges and sharp bends created a labyrinth of currents, where objects could vanish from sight in seconds and reappear elsewhere. The riverbed dropped unevenly, with sandbars and submerged roots forming natural traps that could conceal anything from small debris to living creatures. This complexity made it nearly impossible to predict how an object or person might move once swept beneath the surface. River scientists noted that even gentle currents could produce sudden eddies that masked disturbances, but nothing observed in this instance matched typical hydrodynamic behaviour. Beneath the surface, unexpected sandbars and submerged hollows created pockets where water accelerated or slowed dramatically, forming patterns that even experienced navigators could not predict. These hidden shifts could carry debris or objects in unusual trajectories, leaving investigators to question whether the dragging occurred naturally or under some inexplicable force. Patterns of displaced sediment seemed inconsistent with both observed currents and the known riverbed contours, suggesting that something unseen had manipulated the environment with precision. Shredded reeds and displaced branches clung to the shoreline, the only testament to a struggle that left no visible perpetrator. Evidence was scattered in jagged patterns, as though something or someone had been dragged forcefully through shallow water. Investigators were struck by the precision of the disruption. Natural causes could account for scattered debris, but not for the deliberate linear impressions left behind. Each observation reinforced the notion that whatever occurred had exploited both the river's physical complexity and its concealment. Unusual currents near the bend created small whirlpools and pockets of turbulence that could catch debris or small boats without warning, and hydrologists noted that seasonal variations in the Susquehanna's flow often produced unpredictable surges capable of moving objects in ways that seemed almost intentional. These subtle eddies shifted sticks, reeds, and sediment in strange, erratic patterns, occasionally dragging floating items in multiple directions before depositing them miles downstream. Historical flow data from the US Geological Survey revealed that this section of the river experienced abrupt shifts in water velocity during certain times of the year, which could mask or amplify any disturbance. Yet none of these hydrological quirks could fully account for the precision and speed recorded in the dragging incident. Investigators noted that the combination of hidden currents, submerged debris, and rapidly changing water levels created a natural environment uniquely capable of both concealing and accelerating movement, making human observation nearly impossible. Fish, snapping turtles, and the occasional waterfowl were present, yet experts confirmed none could account for the speed, direction, or force of the disturbance. Catfish might thrash near the riverbed, but their movements could not rip vegetation or disturb sediment in the precise manner recorded. Observers noted that even larger aquatic animals were rare in this section of the Susquehanna, further eliminating known wildlife as a plausible cause. The river seemed to behave unnaturally, with ordinary life contributing nothing that could explain the scale of the event. Survey teams found that sediment patterns shifted unpredictably with each current, frustrating efforts to trace the exact path of the dragging. Sonar imaging captured ridges and depressions, yet the results were confusing, with no clear evidence of human or animal presence. Attempts to capture the scene with underwater cameras repeatedly failed, as sediment stirred by currents blurred the images, making reconstruction frustratingly imprecise. The investigators faced a landscape both tangible and illusory, where every clue seemed to contradict another. Residents recalled earlier unexplained events, sudden disturbances, missing gear, and minor injuries, hinting at a stretch of river prone to enigmatic occurrences. Archival accounts mention a rowboat found capsized near a small bend decades earlier, with no explanation for its presence, and a fisherman reporting sudden water turbulence that overturned his trap. Though these incidents were minor and sporadic, they suggested a history of the Susquehanna producing moments of unexplained violence that defied simple explanation. Analysis of drag angles and flow dynamics revealed motion inconsistent with natural or human activity, leaving forensic experts at a standstill. Water displaced in a sharp, linear path suggested deliberate movement, yet the velocity and depth shifts did not correspond to any known craft or current pattern. Scientists could model portions of the event, but could not replicate the combination of rapid movement, sediment displacement, and subtle environmental effects observed at the scene. The more closely it was studied, the more inexplicable the event became. Even seasoned river guides admitted that narrow channels and hidden snags made the water treacherous, amplifying the peril posed by whatever had caused the incident. Navigating the bends required constant vigilance, as submerged routes and abrupt depth changes could flip a boat or pin it unexpectedly. The guides emphasized that visibility alone could not reveal the river's hidden complexities, making humans highly vulnerable in areas where unknown forces might already be at work. Twisted reeds, scoured mud, and dislodged sediment suggested a sudden, deliberate force at work, yet no trace of the source remained. These anomalies left investigators puzzled, as nothing in the river's known behavior or its inhabitants could account for the intensity and precision of the disturbance. Even detailed photographs and measurements revealed inconsistencies, forcing analysts to confront the possibility that some element of the event had simply eluded detection. Those who'd observed the event described a lingering unease, a sensation that the river had acknowledged their presence and silently judged their inability to comprehend what it had done. The water's slow movement seemed deliberate, carrying the subtle memory of violence that had passed unnoticed by most. Investigators admitted that even with modern technology, the human mind struggled to reconcile the river's calm surface with the chaos concealed below, leaving a haunting impression long after the scene was abandoned. As daylight waned, the water's calm surface belied the sudden violence that had occurred beneath, leaving only subtle clues and unanswered questions. Shadows lengthened across the riverbank, and the gentle lapping of water seemed almost unnatural after the chaos observed earlier. Even the birds and small mammals that normally populated the bend seemed hesitant, as though the river retained a memory of the unseen encounter. The scene offered no resolution, only a lingering sense that the river had both witnessed and concealed an extraordinary act. Below the currents of the Susquehanna, the river preserved its secrets with quiet precision, offering answers to no one who dared to look too closely. The Colorado River Rapid Ambush. A sudden roar erupted from the canyon walls, a violent sound that masked the inexplicable attack sweeping through the rapids before anyone could react. Foam churned violently around jagged rocks as kayakers were flung off the course, their paddles spinning uselessly in the rushing water. The Colorado's current surged with a force that seemed almost deliberate, propelling debris and small rafts in erratic, unpredictable paths. Witnesses later recalled the canyon echoing with a sound unlike ordinary whitewater, as though the river itself had announced a sudden, incomprehensible threat. For a moment, time felt distorted, with each second stretching unnaturally as survival became the only focus. One experienced rafter described his raft being snatched sideways, spun in midstream, and slammed against a submerged boulder with a force that should have overturned it completely. Another kayaker struggled to regain control, only to be pushed back upstream by an eddy that formed and vanished almost instantly. Multiple accounts converged on the same impression. The water moved with intelligence, as if reacting to the presence of humans, yet no one could determine the source or mechanism of the attack. Adrenaline and confusion intertwined, leaving those who survived shaken and questioning their perception. Jagged rocks, narrow chutes, and sudden drops created treacherous hazards that might account for some mishaps. Yet the unusual precision of this event stood apart from ordinary river accidents. Submerged boulders formed hidden traps, and rapid channels funneled currents into unpredictable whirlpools. Yet even these natural formations could not explain the speed and trajectory of displaced items. Geological surveys of the canyon show a complex riverbed, shaped over millennia by erosion, which can create chaotic water patterns, but nothing documented could replicate the observed sequence of the ambush. Hydrologists studying the Colorado River noted that flow rates in this canyon section could exceed 30,000 cubic feet per second during seasonal surges. These fluctuations can overturn rafts, displace debris, and accelerate objects at surprising speeds. Yet on the day of the attack, measurements indicated that the water's movement remained within normal seasonal parameters. The discrepancy suggested an additional, unaccountable force had acted within the rapids, capable of manipulating both water and objects in ways that defied conventional fluid dynamics. The roar of the rapids seemed to mask subtle vibrations beneath the water's surface, imperceptible to most but detectable by sensitive instruments deployed downstream. Hydrologists later noted that microcurrents and pressure changes can sometimes ripple through the riverbed in patterns that standard measurements miss. During the ambush, pressure sensors placed for unrelated ecological studies recorded brief spikes inconsistent with ordinary flow, as if a sudden surge had passed beneath the water with near instantaneous force. These readings suggested the water itself might have shifted in ways not fully explained by terrain or volume alone, adding another layer of mystery to a phenomenon already defying conventional understanding of river behaviour. Scattered paddles, fragments of rafts, and personal items were recovered miles downstream, sometimes in positions that defied expected river physics. One kayak paddle was found wedged between rocks in an area considered unreachable by the measured current. Other debris was discovered in tight eddies where water typically slowed, indicating abrupt, anomalous motion. Each recovered item seemed to tell a story of chaos controlled by an unseen hand, leaving investigators baffled at how ordinary hydrological forces could produce such selective, sudden displacement. Eagles circled high above the canyon while trout darted in quieter pools, yet experts confirmed that no wildlife could generate the intensity or precision of the movement observed. River otters, muskrats, and fish were present in expected numbers, and none possessed the physical capacity to overturn rafts or manipulate heavy objects. Forensic assessments eliminated natural animal activity, highlighting that the forces at play could not be attributed to the ecosystem. The river's own environment remained the only consistent factor, yet it provided no answers. Local guides recalled decades of minor incidents, kayaks capsizing inexplicably, small rafts losing control for a moment before recovering, and isolated whirlpools claiming floating debris. Historical newspapers documented similar events with no clear cause, creating a reputation for this canyon stretch as unusually unpredictable and perilous. While previous occurrences were often dismissed as natural hazards, the suddenness and intensity of the recent ambush placed it in a distinct category, drawing the attention of investigators and hydrologists alike. Survey teams faced immediate obstacles attempting underwater documentation. Turbidity, strong currents, and chaotic eddies rendered sonar imaging inconclusive, while high-speed cameras failed to capture meaningful sequences. Sediment swirled in patterns that obscured any trace of the attack, making it impossible to reconstruct the event accurately. Equipment could measure flow and depth, but could not explain why the water and displaced objects had moved in coordinated, abrupt patterns. Each failed attempt only deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the rapids. Even professional guides emphasized the human limitations in fast-moving water. Split-second decisions can mean the difference between safe passage and disaster, and the psychological shock of sudden, inexplicable forces compounds the danger. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and disorientation are constant threats in rapid whitewater. Yet the unusual precision of the attack suggested a phenomenon beyond ordinary risk factors. Those caught in the ambush were forced to confront a combination of natural hazards and something entirely unexplainable, a duality that heightened fear and confusion. Analysis of displaced debris and river flow revealed trajectories inconsistent with human, mechanical, or animal action. Simulations of the current and eddy patterns, using advanced hydrological models, failed to replicate the sudden movements witnessed. Objects accelerated and decelerated in ways that contradicted standard water dynamics, with angles and paths appearing deliberate rather than chaotic. The discrepancy between expected physics and observed outcomes left scientists and investigators at an impasse, unable to reconcile the evidence with known natural processes. Witness statements contained contradictory details, complicating reconstruction efforts. Some reported the attack lasting mere seconds, while others described extended surges with multiple directional shifts. One kayaker claimed the raft spun upstream briefly before being propelled forward again, a detail impossible to reconcile with river mechanics. Variations in perception, compounded by adrenaline and the speed of events, created a fragmented record that only emphasized the river's unpredictable and enigmatic behavior. As dusk settled over the canyon, the rapids returned to a deceptively calm state, flowing quietly as if the chaos had never occurred. Rocks gleamed wetly under fading light, and small eddies lapped at the riverbanks, erasing visible traces of the ambush. Survivors, investigators, and hydrologists alike were left with questions that could not be answered, aware that the river had concealed its secrets in a sudden, violent display. The canyon echoed with silence, an uneasy reminder that the forces at play had not been fully understood. An invisible power had swept through the rapids, leaving only upheaval and questions that no one could confront or follow. The St. John's River mutilation. The first glimmer of sunlight revealed a scene so stark that even seasoned deputies paused, staring at the riverbank where the mutilated remains lay half-submerged in murky water. A thin haze rose from the tannin-stained waters, catching the early light and giving the scene an almost unreal quality. Observers noted that the surrounding mud was surprisingly undisturbed, as though the body had appeared there without struggle. Nearby reeds swayed in the soft morning breeze, contrasting with the brutality now etched into the riverbank. It was immediately clear that this was no ordinary predator attack, no misadventure of local wildlife, but something that defied immediate explanation. Locals who stumbled upon the scene described a chilling quiet, broken only by the occasional drip of water and an almost instinctive understanding that something extraordinary and deeply unsettling had occurred. Fishermen who had spent decades navigating the river admitted a sense of fear they could not articulate, as though the water itself had shifted subtly to conceal the act. Some mentioned the smell of decay and wet vegetation intermingling in ways that seemed unnatural. As authorities cordoned off the area, the witnesses' accounts shared a common thread, a recognition that the St. John's had revealed a darkness they could not comprehend. Forensic specialists noted the precision of the wounds, their symmetry and depth inconsistent with any known animal attack, while the surrounding mud showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. Expert pathologists examined photographs and samples, confirming that the injuries were executed with an almost surgical exactness. Tissue samples bore no traces of typical scavenger marks, and the timing of decomposition suggested the attack occurred overnight, when few humans could have been present. Every observation deepened the mystery. How could such injuries appear in a remote, slow-moving river without clear evidence of intervention? The river itself flowed lazily, its wide channels and tannin-stained waters masking the currents that snaked beneath, creating an unnerving contrast between apparent calm and the violence that had transpired. The water's surface reflected the morning sky in a deceptive serenity, hiding submerged logs, shifting sandbars, and unpredictable microcurrents. Even experienced boaters admitted that in this stretch, the river could behave in subtle ways, shifting unexpectedly with invisible undertows, yet none of the natural patterns could account for the precision or swiftness of the attack that had occurred along its banks. Submerged logs and fallen cypress roots appeared to form natural corridors along the riverbed, yet investigators noticed patterns inconsistent with ordinary water flow. Divers and sonar imaging revealed areas where debris and sediment were displaced in ways that suggested sudden, forceful movement beneath the surface, yet no evidence of machinery or known wildlife could explain it. Measurements showed microcurrents behaving unpredictably around bends, creating pockets of turbulence that could conceal rapid activity. Ecologists noted that even minor shifts in these sediment channels were capable of lifting small objects, but could not account for the precise placement and untouched condition of the body. These observations added a new layer of scientific intrigue to an already confounding mystery. Historical records of the St. John's River hinted at previous oddities, unexplained disappearances, missing fishing equipment, and rare incidents of wildlife aggression that never fully made sense. Archival newspapers from the early 20th century documented sudden vanishings of swimmers and small boats, often attributed to accidents but never fully explained. Local historical societies preserved accounts of fishers returning with bizarre stories of missing nets or half-devoured catches. While these events were scattered over decades, together they created a pattern of subtle, unresolved anomalies tied to the river's quieter reaches. Investigators considered every predator the swamp could harbour: alligators, large fish, even raccoons, but none could account for the clean, methodical injuries that suggested a force beyond ordinary nature. Alligators were common, yet their bite patterns differ significantly, leaving jagged edges and evidence of powerful crushing. Otters and large fish could displace objects but not execute deliberate symmetrical mutilation. Every known animal in the St. John's ecosystem fell short of explaining the exacting nature of the wounds, leaving authorities to confront the unsettling possibility that this incident had no conventional explanation. Environmental conditions further complicated analysis. Shifting sandbars, hidden vegetation, and turbid waters rendered reconstruction nearly impossible, leaving detectives to rely on fragmentary observations. Attempts to drag the riverbed revealed nothing conclusive, as silt and debris constantly obscured potential evidence. Aerial surveys captured distorted images, reflecting the shallow water in angles that made accurate measurements difficult. Even simple observations were deceptive. A log partially submerged could appear like a straight path of travel, while in reality the currents around it shifted unpredictably, creating a natural camouflage for the violent event. Accounts of the river from early settlers and local archives contained tales of unnatural phenomena, from sudden whirlpools appearing without warning to fleeting shadows on the water, documented without embellishment. In one 19th century diary, a traveller described a stretch of the river where fish leapt unnaturally high and the water seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. Though largely anecdotal, these accounts echo the modern reports, suggesting a long-standing recognition of mysterious forces in certain sections of the St. John's. They lent the investigation a historical depth, hinting that the recent mutilation may have tapped into patterns the river had exhibited for centuries. Witness reports diverged sharply on key details: the exact location of the remains, the orientation of debris, and even the apparent water level at the moment of discovery, making the event difficult to pin down. One fisherman recalled seeing the body floating near a willow-lined bend, while another insisted it had been closer to the opposite bank. Some mentioned small whirlpools appearing spontaneously, while others saw none. These discrepancies could be attributed to human perception under stress, yet collectively they reinforced the sense that the river itself had been acting unpredictably, challenging conventional understanding. Modern scientific attempts to clarify the incident, from DNA testing to hydrological modelling, failed to reconcile anomalies in the evidence, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Flow simulations could not replicate the sudden appearance and precise placement of the remains, and forensic tests revealed no mechanical instruments or human tools involved. Even the presence of bacteria and decomposition patterns did not fully explain why certain areas were untouched, while others bore precise injuries. The data suggested an unusual convergence of forces that resisted all conventional interpretation. Patterns emerged only in their absence. Similar attacks in nearby rivers displayed comparable precision and minimal disturbance, hinting at a phenomenon that left tangible evidence yet resisted comprehension. Researchers noted that stretches of slow, deep water in swamp-fed rivers occasionally revealed mutilated remains with minimal environmental disruption. While each case remained unsolved, the repetition of certain features, the rapid, precise injuries, lack of obvious predators, and untouched surrounding terrain hinted at a phenomenon consistently observable, yet fundamentally mysterious. As night fell, the St. John's River reflected the dim glow of lanterns along the bank, a tranquil surface concealing the violent and inexplicable forces that had left a permanent mark on all who witnessed the aftermath. Shadows lengthened across reeds and submerged logs, emphasizing the calm surface above the chaos below. Investigators packed their equipment, wary of the dark water that had already claimed more than one human observer. The river remained unchanged in appearance, yet every participant sensed that it had been altered, if only in memory and consequence. An unseen presence had enacted its precision along the riverbank, leaving silence and questions as the only witnesses to its passing. The Snake River Canyon Attack. Sunlight fractured through the canyon walls in sharp angles, illuminating sections of the riverbank where rocks had been violently shifted, and signs of a sudden, unexplainable assault were etched into the terrain. Local hikers who had ventured early that morning described the area as eerily silent, with only the distant rush of the river filling the canyon. Despite the seemingly calm surroundings, the scene suggested a sudden, violent event had occurred, leaving both the environment and anyone who discovered it unsettled. The disrupted rocks, scattered driftwood, and disturbed sand hinted at forces that no ordinary accident or known predator could produce. The river flowed with a deceptive calm, yet ripples along isolated eddies hinted at an invisible force that had interacted with both water and sediment in ways no observer could explain. Small whirlpools and unusual currents shifted unpredictably around the canyon's narrow bends, making it difficult to reconstruct how the attack had unfolded. Boaters and kayakers familiar with the river noted that the water behaved normally upstream and downstream, yet this particular stretch seemed marked by a sudden anomaly, as if the river itself had participated in the violence. Examination of the victim revealed injuries that defied conventional patterns, precise and localized, inconsistent with any known predator or human activity documented in the area. Medical examiners noted deep punctures and sharp lacerations that appeared deliberate, yet showed no indication of a struggle against a visible attacker. Clothing was torn in ways that could not be explained by contact with rocks or debris, and the positioning of the body suggested it had been displaced in a manner that defied gravity and current alone. The scene presented a forensic puzzle that left even seasoned investigators unsettled. Angular rock formations and steep terraces created pockets of turbulence and hidden currents, producing conditions where a violent event could occur almost entirely hidden from view. Water moving through submerged channels formed eddies that could carry objects suddenly yet invisibly downstream, yet nothing could account for the exact precision of the injuries observed. Riverbank logs, boulders, and partially exposed roots showed signs of impact, as if an invisible hand had swept through, leaving traces only in the subtle rearrangement of natural features. Hydrological surveys noted sudden, erratic surges around submerged boulders and narrow bends, yet none could fully account for the abrupt, targeted nature of the assault. Experts studied flow rates, seasonal water levels, and microcurrents, finding patterns that could shift objects or sediment unpredictably. Still, these forces alone could not explain the combination of rapid movement, exact placement, and the lack of disturbance in surrounding areas, leaving the assault a mystery beyond ordinary river physics. Historical records mentioned occasional disappearances and unexplained accidents in this stretch of the Snake River, long dismissed by authorities, but now gaining ominous significance in context. Early 20th century accounts included hunters or fishermen vanishing under circumstances that mirrored the current case, isolated locations, minimal witness observation, and bodies discovered with injuries inconsistent with predation or accidental trauma. Archival newspapers and local folklore hinted at the river's unpredictability, yet these tales were rarely given serious consideration until now. Local oral histories collected from nearby communities describe the Snake River as having sections where water seems to vanish and reappear, or where currents suddenly change direction without warning. Fishermen and ranchers have long spoken of isolated stretches that defy usual river behaviour, with floating debris sometimes moving against the current or disappearing entirely into hidden channels. While most dismissed these accounts as folklore, the strange fluidity of water and sediment in these stretches offers a potential explanation, or at least a context, for how inexplicable injuries and sudden shifts in the environment could occur, hinting at natural forces still poorly understood. Wildlife present in the canyon, from large predatory fish to river otters, could not reproduce the unusual injury patterns nor act undetected in such confined, turbulent spaces. Ecologists studying the river noted that most native predators are territorial and leave identifiable traces of feeding or struggle. The sharp, surgical-like wounds on the victim, combined with the lack of drag marks or claw patterns, suggested an attack by something outside the known behavioural range of local fauna. This discrepancy further deepened the mystery, leaving experts to question if an entirely unknown force was at play. Access along the river was severely limited, with narrow ledges and vertical inclines making the possibility of human involvement virtually impossible, narrowing explanations to the truly mysterious. The canyon's steep walls prevented stealthy movement from above, while the river's rapid currents and rocky banks made approach from below dangerous and unlikely. Investigators concluded that even a determined individual would struggle to execute such an attack and escape undetected, heightening the sense that the assault occurred through means not bound by ordinary constraints. Sediment displacement and scattered debris were studied in detail, revealing abrupt changes that suggested a sudden, powerful interaction below the water's surface, yet no conventional cause could be identified. Small rocks were shifted and logs partially submerged in patterns inconsistent with typical river movement, hinting at a sudden, intense force that appeared and vanished with no trace. Sonar scans and underwater photography confirmed that the disruption extended beyond the immediate site, but all efforts to locate any source, mechanical, animal, or human, came up empty. Investigators struggled to reconstruct the scene, hindered by treacherous footing, unstable rocks, and currents that shifted even during careful observation, leaving many questions unanswered. Teams worked over multiple days, attempting to map sediment patterns and recreate possible scenarios, yet each hypothesis clashed with at least one observed fact. The combination of the river's natural volatility and the unexplainable precision of the attack meant that traditional forensic methods could reveal little, and even the most methodical analysis only deepened the uncertainty. Comparisons with similar events in remote river canyons revealed recurring elements: precision, minimal environmental disruption, and the absence of identifiable perpetrators, reinforcing the sense of an inexplicable phenomenon. Cases along other western rivers demonstrated that such attacks were not isolated, with bodies found in remote locations exhibiting comparable injuries and evidence patterns. These parallels offered chilling suggestions that some unknown factor, perhaps unique to isolated riverine environments, could repeatedly manifest with terrifying precision. As dusk approached, shadows stretched across the river, and the water reflected the canyon's stillness, creating an almost unnatural silence that seemed to hold the memory of the attack itself. Even as night fell, the river appeared unchanged, its currents whispering against rocks, offering no clue to the forces that had acted there. Investigators left the canyon with lingering unease, aware that the Snake River had concealed a violent and unexplainable event, its mysteries hidden beneath the surface and in the cliffs that framed the water. Whatever moved through the Snake River Canyon that day left no trail except the memory of violence and the haunting certainty that some forces remain entirely beyond understanding. The Hudson River Pier Assault. Dim lights from nearby waterfront buildings cast fragmented reflections across the Hudson, highlighting the scattered planks and twisted rope that marked the site of the unexplained assault along the pier. Even at a distance, the pier appeared ordinary, yet subtle disarray in its structure suggested that something violent had occurred under cover of darkness. Investigators quickly noted the absence of footprints leading to or from the water, raising questions about whether the victim had been moved or whether the force that struck was unseen. Shadows clung to the pilings and crevices between wooden beams, obscuring evidence that might have clarified the nature of the attack. The combination of urban architecture and river currents created a setting in which ordinary explanation seemed inadequate. Footprints and scuff marks, half washed by tidal lapping, suggested a struggle that had unfolded quickly, yet left almost no trace, leaving investigators to reconstruct what could not be seen. The marks, shallow and irregular, appeared to record movement in multiple directions, as if the victim had been forced or displaced repeatedly. Small splashes of disturbed sediment hinted at sudden contact with water, yet the ebbing tide had already erased the most critical details. While typical crimes leave patterns, footprints, drag marks, and signs of forced entry, the Hudson Pier scene resisted interpretation, revealing only fragments of motion frozen in time. Local fishermen reported hearing a series of sharp thuds and metallic creaks hours before dawn, sounds that disappeared into the fog as suddenly as they had appeared. Some described a low, groaning resonance from the pier's wooden beams, while others swore they glimpsed movement too fast to track. Maritime logs and Coast Guard records confirmed unusual, nighttime activity along that section of the river, although no vessels were reported nearby. These accounts, though anecdotal, gained credibility when multiple witnesses described similar sounds independently, adding an auditory layer to the puzzle of the assault. The tide rose and fell with unusual force near the pilings, creating subtle eddies and currents that seemed capable of moving both debris and bodies with deceptive speed. Hydrologists studying the site noted that narrow channels and submerged beams can amplify small forces, producing sudden turbulence that could affect objects in ways observers rarely predict. While such currents can explain displacement of loose debris, they fail to account for the localized, precise trauma evident on the victim, leaving investigators to question whether natural forces alone were responsible. The river's behavior combined with structural quirks formed a scene where ordinary reasoning could not fully explain the assault. Historical records from the 19th and 20th centuries revealed isolated cases of mysterious pier accidents along the Hudson, often dismissed as misfortune but now eerily resonant with the recent attack. Maritime logs documented sudden disappearances of dock workers and cargo mishaps, under conditions that mirrored the present incident. Darkness, minimal witnesses, and unexpected violence. Newspaper accounts described early accounts of victims found with injuries inconsistent with typical accidents, lending a historical weight to the investigation. These past events, once forgotten or marginalized, now framed the pier as a site where both human and environmental factors seemed to conspire in enigmatic ways. Local oral histories collected from nearby communities describe stretches of the Hudson where water behaves unpredictably, with currents vanishing into hidden channels or swirling against expected patterns. Fishermen and dock workers have long recounted experiences of debris or small boats moving in inexplicable ways, at times disappearing briefly before reappearing downstream. While most dismiss these tales as folklore, they offer a framework for understanding how sudden, violent interactions with the river could occur. Such knowledge, once overlooked, now gains relevance in explaining the mechanics, or at least the context, of the unexplainable assault at the pier. Inspection of the pier's construction exposed narrow gaps and hidden corners, places where both a victim and an assailant, or something else entirely, could interact without observation. Rusted bolts, uneven boards, and shadowed voids provided concealment, and the pier's irregular layout complicated line-of-sight visibility. Even seasoned investigators found the structure deceptive, with a combination of light, shadow, and geometry creating moments in which a violent act could go unnoticed. This insight reinforced the notion that the environment itself played an active role in shaping the conditions of the assault. Examinations of injuries on the victim revealed patterns inconsistent with blunt force or typical animal attack, showing sharp, localized trauma that suggested precision beyond ordinary explanation. Medical examiners emphasized that the punctures and lacerations lacked accompanying signs of struggle, and no evidence indicated defensive action against a conventional assailant. Clothing fibers were torn cleanly in areas inaccessible to normal river hazards, hinting at forces that could bypass ordinary contact. Such anomalies placed the incident outside familiar categories, challenging both forensic interpretation and conventional river hazard assessments. Fog drifting across the water, reflecting in darkened shadows between pilings, made even the nearest witnesses unsure of what they had seen, turning familiar surroundings into an alien environment. Visual distortions created by low light and water reflections may have contributed to misperceptions, but could not explain the physical evidence left behind. Observers reported fleeting glimpses of movement where none should have existed, adding to the tension and unease that permeated the investigation. The interplay between natural phenomena and structural concealment made the pier a setting where reality itself seemed distorted. Forensic specialists and structural engineers alike could find no explanation that reconciled the environment, human accessibility, and the unusual nature of the injuries documented that night. The combination of tidal forces, pier architecture, and the victim's positioning defied attempts at straightforward reconstruction. Experiments using dummies and simulated currents produced only partial replication, confirming that the assault involved factors beyond ordinary understanding. Even experts agree that the mystery could not be resolved solely through conventional analysis, leaving the incident to linger unresolved in professional reports. Similar incidents along urban rivers, from New York Harbor to Boston's Charles River, showed comparable traits: precision, minimal environmental disruption, and no identifiable perpetrator, deepening the sense of mystery. These cases suggested a recurring phenomenon in densely built waterfronts, where water, human activity, and concealed spaces intersect to produce circumstances that leave investigators baffled. Patterns of injury, environmental interaction, and witness accounts aligned enough to suggest a broader, unexplained pattern of river assaults in urban settings. The combination of limited visibility, intermittent pedestrian traffic, and the pier's structural intricacies created conditions where an extraordinary event could occur without detection, baffling even seasoned investigators. Access points, shadowed corners, and fluctuating currents offered both concealment and sudden movement, allowing a rapid assault with minimal evidence left behind. These converging factors illustrated how the urban river environment could hide acts of extreme violence, creating a puzzle that defied conventional reasoning and left witnesses unsettled long after the incident. By sunrise, the river's surface had returned to its normal rhythm. The pier stood silent, and all that remained were the faint traces of a violent, inexplicable event that would leave questions lingering for years. Evidence seemed almost designed to frustrate understanding, with subtle disruptions hinting at chaos yet defying explanation. Investigators departed with unease, aware that the Hudson River's waters and the pier's geometry had conspired in a manner both precise and untraceable. The Hudson kept its secrets tightly that morning, leaving only shadows and unanswered questions along the water's edge. The Missouri River Sandbar Incident. A sharp, hollow thud echoed across the sandbar before anyone could see what had caused it, a sound that hinted at sudden, inexplicable violence. Local reports from anglers and passing boaters described the commotion as a mixture of splashes and cries, though nothing in the immediate area seemed capable of producing such force. The sandbar itself, a shifting formation in the middle of the Missouri, created natural isolation, cutting off movement and offering the kind of vulnerability that ordinary river hazards rarely produced. Witnesses struggled to explain what had happened, leaving authorities with a scene that seemed both ordinary and profoundly unsettling. Grains of sand shifted underfoot, forming temporary ridges and pits that could conceal movement or change the path of someone caught in a struggle. The sandbar's composition was notoriously unstable. Even minimal water movement could reshape its surface in moments. Investigators noted footprints that disappeared mid-stride and depressions that seemed too deep for a single person to have caused. These subtle, yet critical details added to the growing confusion. Any attempt to reconstruct the incident using normal river physics seemed to fall short, and each new observation hinted at forces at work that no one could account for. Nearby spectators described fleeting shadows darting along the edges of their vision, paired with urgent splashes that left them uncertain whether they had imagined the danger. A fisherman recalled seeing a sudden flicker in the sandbar's periphery before the water erupted violently, as though an invisible hand had propelled someone into the current. Others felt a strange vibration in the ground beneath them, a sensation almost like a pulse, adding to the atmosphere of tension and disorientation. The combination of sight, sound, and tactile uncertainty made the incident feel surreal, and even experienced locals found themselves questioning what they had truly witnessed. The individual caught in the assault stood on a narrow stretch of sand, hemmed in by unstable sediment and sudden depressions that offered no easy escape. Current maps of the Missouri reveal areas where sandbars constrict the river's flow, creating natural choke points, but these alone could not explain the unusual injuries documented afterward. The placement of the victim suggested exposure to both ordinary river hazards and something far less predictable. Eyewitness accounts consistently emphasized how suddenly the attack had begun and how little time anyone had to react, leaving a scene of chaos with no clear origin or cause. Analysis revealed that strong currents beneath the surface could lift and drag objects unpredictably, making conventional explanations for the attack nearly impossible. Hydrodynamic studies of the sandbar show that minor shifts in sediment can create hidden eddies capable of sudden violent force. Logs and debris can be propelled without warning, yet the injuries noted in the incident were inconsistent with such ordinary phenomena. Even with modern measurement tools, experts could not recreate the movement that would result in the specific patterns found on site, leaving the event partially defying natural law as understood by local authorities and scientists alike. Historical records hint at other inexplicable injuries and disappearances along Missouri sandbars, suggesting that the river had a long, poorly understood history of hazards. Local newspapers from the early 20th century occasionally note swimmers or boaters vanishing near isolated sandbars, often chalked up to drowning or misadventure. Yet the common threads, sudden violence, minimal evidence, and the victim's unusual positioning mirror the modern incident in unnerving ways. These recurring anomalies hint at a broader pattern, one in which the river's physical behaviour alone cannot account for the outcomes, leaving the possibility of entirely unrecognised forces at play. Disturbances in the sand indicated erratic movement, inconsistent with either natural flow patterns or human footprints, as if an unseen force had intervened. Close inspection revealed swirls and indentations that could not easily be explained by waves or the victim's movements, forming small tracks that seemed to appear and vanish unpredictably. Surveying the area, authorities found pockets of compacted sediment where no one had stepped and channels where the sand had shifted without any apparent cause. Each of these anomalies compounded the mystery, making it increasingly clear that the incident had occurred under conditions outside ordinary explanation. A strange stillness had settled over the area just before the assault, the air thick and heavy in a way witnesses later described as unnatural. Birds fell silent along the riverbanks, and even the usual buzz of insects seemed muted. Several people mentioned a subtle vibration in the ground, and a faint odour reminiscent of wet clay and riverine flora, which intensified the sense that something atypical was imminent. The combination of sensory phenomena, visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory, gave the witnesses a perception that the river itself had changed, though no scientific measurement could confirm anything abnormal. Specialists examining the scene found themselves baffled, unable to reconcile the physical evidence with eyewitness accounts, as if the incident had unfolded according to rules unknown to science. Investigators, including environmental scientists and law enforcement, noted injuries and patterns that defied standard models of drowning, animal attack, or accident. The irregularities in sediment, water flow, and the victim's positioning resisted logical reconstruction. Even with modern forensic equipment and detailed witness statements, the case presented anomalies that seemed to exist at the intersection of natural forces and unexplained phenomena. Comparisons with other American river assaults revealed a recurring theme of sudden, inexplicable aggression, though each incident had its own distinct environmental signature. Scholars reviewing historical cases, from Maine to the Mississippi, observed that these attacks shared one key characteristic: victims encountered extreme, localized force without predictable precursors or residual evidence. In every scenario, the surrounding terrain, whether sand, mud, or submerged logs, interacted with the river in ways that obscured cause, leaving investigators with fragments that refused to form a coherent narrative. The sandbar's narrow passages amplified vulnerability, turning ordinary missteps into life-threatening hazards in the midst of shifting terrain. In addition to water and sand, small debris and uneven patches of compacted sediment added subtle obstacles that increased the risk of misstep or entrapment. Witnesses noted how easily one could lose footing in seconds, yet these hazards alone could not fully explain the extent of injuries sustained or the suddenness of the assault. Every measurement and observation reinforced the impression that the sandbar was not simply a hazard, but an environment capable of amplifying something far more sinister. As shadows lengthened over the sandbar, the disturbed sediment slowly settled, giving the illusion of calm while the river seemed to guard the truth of what had occurred. No footprints, no debris, and no discernible pattern remained that could definitively reconstruct the scene. Locals cautiously avoided the area for weeks afterward, leaving only scattered reports of strange sensations and inexplicable splashes for researchers to piece together. The river had returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet the memory of the assault lingered, a reminder of its capacity for sudden, unaccountable violence. No trace remained of what had struck the victims, leaving only the unsettling sense that the river itself had dictated the rules of the attack. The Allegheny River screams. The waters of the Allegheny shimmered oddly, reflecting the dense foliage on its banks with a surface that seemed unnervingly tense, as if anticipating some unseen disturbance. Locals walking along the river's edge noticed subtle ripples in places where there should have been calm, and small eddies twisted unnaturally around rocks and debris, defying the usual flow. Several witnesses recalled a fleeting sense of unease, their instincts signalling that something invisible had passed beneath the surface, brushing against the river's current in a manner that could not be explained by natural phenomena alone. Along the winding bends, exposed roots and jagged rocks formed deceptive patterns, hiding shallow pockets and undercurrents that could sweep away a careless foot or snag a boat. Yet amidst these familiar hazards, investigators found signs of disruption that no ordinary waterway should produce. Reeds broken at precise angles, small logs carried far from the main current, and soil that appeared gouged in ways inconsistent with tides or storms. These subtle clues hinted at a deliberate force, one that left the landscape familiar yet fundamentally altered in its wake. Fishermen who had worked these waters for decades spoke of an odd awareness, a prickling sensation that followed them along the riverbanks. Even when the sun shone brightly and the water reflected nothing more than blue sky, they felt observed by something unseen. Anglers reported catching glimpses of movement below the surface that vanished before recognition, a fleeting presence that unsettled both the eye and the mind. The repetition of these accounts across unrelated observers suggested the phenomenon was not imagined, but an enduring and inexplicable feature of the river itself. Investigators documented the vegetation along the banks and noticed patterns that could not be attributed to ordinary currents or seasonal change. Clumps of reeds appeared stripped from the soil, rocks slightly shifted, and trees had shallow scratches along their trunks in seemingly random but precise placements. While none of these marks could directly account for the injuries and disorientation reported, they established a physical trace of disturbance, a silent record of events witnessed only by the river and its immediate environment. Local newspapers and municipal records revealed a history of anomalous occurrences along this same stretch of the Allegheny. In decades past, unexplained injuries, sudden disappearances of small boats, and disorienting whirlpools had been noted, each incident sharing similar patterns of rapid, invisible forces acting upon unsuspecting individuals. The consistency of these accounts, across generations and communities, suggested a phenomenon that defied conventional explanation, one that had persisted quietly, often overlooked amid the normal flow of everyday life. Hydrologists and river engineers studying this stretch noted unusual currents forming near hidden bends, shallow undercuts, and narrow channels. While these currents could influence the movement of logs and debris, they failed to account for the human impact reported in multiple accounts. Boats that were moored securely seemed to twist or shift as if an unseen hand had nudged them, and individuals on the water described moments when balance seemed impossible, as though gravity and current had combined into something unpredictable, a localized disturbance that defied typical hydraulic patterns. Curious formations along the riverbed drew the attention of geologists and divers who discovered clusters of unusually smooth stones that seemed polished far beyond the natural action of water and sediment. Some rocks were wedged into narrow crevices in ways that could redirect currents or create sudden turbulence, potentially explaining the abrupt, disorienting movements reported by witnesses. Even small aquatic plants were bent or twisted into patterns inconsistent with the flow of the river. These subtle anomalies suggested a combination of geological idiosyncrasies and unknown forces interacting, leaving investigators uncertain whether the river itself or something else entirely was responsible for the sudden attacks. Acoustic experts examined the river's sounds, intrigued by reports of strange resonances along the banks. Certain bends amplified water movement, creating low-frequency vibrations that could unsettle even the most experienced observers. Yet the intensity of the noises described by witnesses exceeded what could be produced naturally, and recordings failed to capture the full effect. The auditory element of the incidents added another layer to the mystery, a presence that announced itself faintly, through vibrations and whispers, but always remained just out of reach of concrete measurement. Several victims recounted a sudden and disorienting vertigo, describing moments when the water beneath them seemed to shift in unpredictable ways. These experiences were not purely psychological. Physical evidence, such as scuffed boots, scraped oars, and displaced gear, suggested that tangible forces were at work. Individuals found themselves struggling to maintain balance, as if a hidden, irregular current had seized control of the river itself, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Such accounts were consistent across multiple independent witnesses, reinforcing the sense that something genuinely unexplainable had occurred. Law enforcement teams combed the area for evidence but found contradictory and perplexing results. Some markers pointed towards strong mechanical action, while others suggested the force was almost imperceptible, capable of moving objects without leaving significant traces. Attempts to reconcile eyewitness testimony with tangible evidence repeatedly failed. Investigators were left with fragments of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture, a series of scattered clues that implied design, but whose architect remained completely unknown. Careful observation of recurring incidents along this stretch revealed subtle patterns. The disturbances tended to follow certain bends, appearing where currents converged or where underwater structures created eddies and whirlpools. Even so, these patterns were far from predictable. The river seemed to maintain its own rhythm, one that manipulated both natural and human elements without warning. Residents and long-time river users came to regard this portion of the Allegheny with a mixture of fascination and wariness, aware that the water could act in ways completely beyond comprehension. The human response was consistent: avoidance. Even after weeks of study and numerous reports, locals hesitated to approach the affected areas. Parents warned children to steer clear of certain bends, fishermen altered routes, and recreational boaters remained vigilant, perpetually aware that something in the river defied the ordinary. Stories of sudden disorientation, unusual vibrations, and invisible forces were recounted quietly, as if sharing them aloud might invite repetition or provoke the river itself. The incidents became a part of local folklore, whispered warnings echoing alongside historical accounts. Reflections on the river's surface betrayed nothing to the casual observer. Sunlight glinted off smooth currents, and the sound of water lapping against banks was as ordinary as ever. Yet faint impressions along the shoreline, a displaced log, a scuffed patch of mud, a broken reed, revealed a history of sudden, violent contact. The landscape bore subtle testimony to events that no camera or observer had fully captured, leaving the river simultaneously familiar and profoundly alien, a place where natural law seemed occasionally suspended. The waters of the Allegheny seemed ordinary, yet something lingering beneath its surface hinted at a truth no one had ever witnessed. the Rogue River fishermen attack. The Rogue River in southern Oregon winds through dense forests and jagged canyons, its waters teeming with salmon and steelhead, yet serene enough to lure anglers from across the state. Along a familiar stretch near Grants Pass, an experienced fisherman found himself abruptly pulled from shallow water in a way that would confound authorities and locals alike. The injuries he sustained were profound, involving deep lacerations and crushed bones, yet none corresponded to the river's documented wildlife, leaving a chilling void where answers should have been. A veteran of the Rogue, the fisherman had spent decades reading the river's currents, predicting the salmon runs, and navigating the hidden eddies that could capsize an inexperienced angler. On the day of the attack, he had set up his gear as usual, wading carefully into a narrow bend where the current slowed against a natural shelf. According to his account, a sudden, almost magnetic pull dragged him under, followed by intense pressure that left him unable to resist. The sensation of being gripped and twisted in shallow water defied both explanation and prior experience. Local biologists and wildlife specialists were quick to respond, drawn by the unusual nature of the injuries. Steelhead, rainbow trout, and the occasional river otter inhabit these waters, but none could have inflicted the concentrated trauma observed. The claw marks and punctures suggested deliberate action, spaced in a way that indicated awareness and control. Even the rare black bear in Rogue's riparian zones could not account for the combination of crushing force and precise tearing noted on the fisherman's limbs. Rescue personnel described the shoreline as eerily untouched yet subtly disturbed. Gravel and reeds were bent as though something immense had passed through, yet no tracks were visible, no footprints, paw prints, or drag marks indicated a path away from the site. The fisherman's waders were shredded in multiple places, and his rods and tackle scattered in a pattern inconsistent with a simple fall. Investigators found themselves confronting a scenario that blended deliberate violence with the apparent absence of a perpetrator. Medical staff documented injuries that bore signs of both crushing and slicing, indicating that immense pressure had been applied before a sharp force completed the trauma. Radiographs revealed fractures at unusual angles, and specialists remarked that no known animal in the Pacific Northwest could generate such a combination. Even seasoned emergency responders expressed unease, noting the precision of the injuries alongside their raw severity. It was as though the assailant had possessed both knowledge and inhuman strength. Authorities questioned the fisherman extensively, hoping to piece together a timeline of events. He recalled striking the riverbed with the full weight of his body, yet something had held him down, suppressing instinctual reactions to roll or escape. The attack lasted only moments in his recollection, yet those minutes had left injuries that would take months to heal. Even more perplexing, the river itself appeared completely still afterward, the surface reflecting sunlight as if nothing had occurred. Ecologists consulted on the case confirmed that Rogue's waters, though powerful in certain stretches, could not create such targeted trauma on a human body. Currents can bruise, sweep someone downstream, or even trap a limb against rocks, but they cannot crush bones in the manner observed. The incident suggested a force external to both water and known wildlife. Hydrodynamics alone could not explain why the injuries were focused on specific areas rather than distributed along the body, as a natural fall or entrapment would produce. Locals who frequented the Rogue recounted subtle, almost imperceptible signs in the days before the attack. Anglers reported fleeting ripples without wind, shadows darting below the surface, and a persistent sensation of being observed, particularly near deep pools or narrow chutes. These accounts, though anecdotal, gained traction among the fishing community as word of the fisherman's injuries spread. It seemed the river itself had become a place where the ordinary rules of nature might not always apply. The Rogue River's conditions in late summer and early fall can be deceptively calm, with sunlight filtering through dense canopy to create dappled patterns on the water, yet currents remain unpredictable, swirling beneath seemingly placid pools. Anglers often describe the river as capricious, with sudden undercurrents and hidden drop-offs, and yet nothing in these well-mapped hazards could account for the extraordinary force that struck the fishermen. Seasonal fish runs bring increased activity from predators, including osprey and river otters, but none possess the capacity or aggression to inflict injuries of such intensity, leaving an unsettling gap between the known river ecology and the evidence observed. Even local guides, accustomed to the quirks of Rogue waters, admitted privately that the fisherman's attack exceeded anything in recorded experience. Law enforcement scoured the surrounding forest and riverbank for signs of human interference, considering the possibility of an ambush or prank gone awry. Footprints were absent, campsites untouched, and the nearest access roads lay hundreds of meters away, separated by dense brush and steep embankments. The isolation of the site compounded the mystery, suggesting either a remarkable natural occurrence or something entirely unknown moving silently through the waters. Yet, months after the incident, the fisherman returned briefly to the river's edge, testing the currents and checking familiar fishing spots, yet he avoided wading into the deeper pools where he'd been attacked. Experts continued environmental surveys documenting water temperatures, seasonal fish movements, and potential hazards, but none explained the unusual trauma. In conversations with peers, he often stressed the absence of anything ordinary in the attack, the combination of crushing power, cutting force, and the precise way he had been lifted and pulled under. In the weeks following the incident, the local angling community became quietly apprehensive, speaking in hushed tones about the event while adjusting their routines. Scientific observers who visited the site documented water conditions, tested for unusual wildlife activity, and recorded currents and pool depths, yet their findings offered no explanation. The combination of targeted force, untouched surroundings, and complete absence of human involvement created a persistent sense of unease, one that echoed along the riverbanks long after the fisherman had recovered. Conversations among experts and anglers alike often returned to the same question: what in the Rogue River could wield such strength with precise intent? Even years later, the Rogue River fisherman attack remains a reference point among those who traverse its waters, a singular moment when human experience collided with an inexplicable force. Anglers continue to recount tales of sudden currents, strange shadows, and the persistent feeling that something lies beneath the surface, waiting. The combination of force, precision, and absence of known causes ensures that this incident lingers as a profound mystery, one that resists scientific classification and leaves those who hear it with a lingering unease. And somewhere in the depths, the river seems to remember exactly what happened that day. The Red River Border Assault. Shadows stretched across the Red River's surface as a lone patrol officer followed the quiet border stretch, unaware that the night was already turning hostile. The river, winding along the Texas-Oklahoma line, had long been known for its shifting currents and low, swampy banks, but even the most experienced officers could not anticipate the sudden, violent assault that would defy explanation. What began as a routine monitoring patrol quickly escalated into an encounter that left the man injured, and investigators questioning whether something unknown had emerged from the waters. Thick brush and gnarled trees lined the riverbanks, creating blind corners where the current whispered and the moonlight barely touched the muddy shore. Sandbars and fallen logs made footing treacherous, and the low hum of cicadas mingled with distant bird calls to cloak any subtle movement. At times the river appeared almost to pause, its surface glassy and calm, yet beneath, shifting silt and hidden snags told a story of quiet, latent danger. This combination of deceptive tranquility and obscured terrain set the stage for an encounter that would defy conventional explanation. A sudden disturbance in the still water caught the officer's attention, a ripple too deliberate to be caused by wind or fish, drawing attention he could not name. He stopped mid-step, shining his flashlight toward the river's edge, but saw nothing. Small movements among reeds and submerged roots might explain minor currents, yet the sense of something larger and deliberate pressing toward him persisted, sending a chill up his spine. He had patrolled this area for years, but instinct told him this was unlike any previous encounter. Without warning, a violent force struck from the shallows, crushing and tearing with precision, leaving injuries that defied all understanding of the river's known predators. The officer was thrown backward, his body slammed against mud and tree roots, sustaining deep punctures and fractures. The power behind the assault was unlike that of a bear or wild boar. The mark suggested something with both tremendous strength and focused intent. Blood mingled with the dark water as he fought to retain consciousness, yet no recognizable attacker revealed itself. Branches snapped and water churned in unnatural patterns as the officer struggled to regain footing, yet no visible assailant emerged from the darkness. The sound of snapping reeds and splashing water filled the night, echoing against the river's banks, yet there were no footprints in the soft mud and no signs of human interference. It was as if the river itself had produced a force that acted with awareness, striking quickly and disappearing without a trace. The officer's radio remained static, amplifying the isolation of the moment. Bite marks and puncture wounds examined by specialists revealed spacing and depth unlike anything recorded in native wildlife, suggesting a power that was both deliberate and inhuman. Forensic experts noted crushing and tearing patterns inconsistent with the jaws of coyotes, bobcats, or any riverine predator. The injuries indicated a force capable of both brute strength and calculated precision, leaving researchers unsettled and intrigued. Even those accustomed to unusual wildlife encounters found the data baffling and disturbing. Fellow Border Patrol officers recalled fleeting shadows along the river, sudden splashes without wind, and the eerie sensation that something watched from beneath the surface. Some spoke of moments when a calm stretch would erupt, briefly, only to return to stillness seconds later. Others noted an uncanny pattern of disturbance near particular sandbars and bends, suggesting a presence that preferred specific areas along the river. While anecdotal, these accounts reinforced the sense of an intelligence at work beyond ordinary explanation. The Red River has long been a site of boundary disputes and survey expeditions, yet even decades of human activity could not account for the violent anomalies now documented along its banks. Historical records detail the challenges of mapping the meandering river, the frequent flooding, and the dangers posed by sudden drops and hidden logs. Local communities have always treated certain stretches with caution, yet none reported injuries of the severity or precision displayed in this assault. The attack remained outside the known history of the area, creating tension among both locals and authorities. Investigators returned to the scene repeatedly, measuring water currents, testing mud and soil, and searching for any clue that might explain the unmatched strength behind the attack. Equipment was carefully placed along the river's edge, and high-resolution photographs documented water patterns, but no conclusive evidence appeared. The mud bore no drag marks, the brush showed no repeated disturbance, and no human tracks were found within hundreds of meters. Each survey deepened the mystery rather than clarifying it. In the weeks following the assault, the officers' every patrol carried an undercurrent of unease, a wariness born not of threat alone but of a force entirely unknown. Colleagues noted subtle changes in behaviour, how he avoided certain bends or shallow areas where the river seemed to watch. Sleep was restless, memories of the sudden impact vivid enough to blur into dreams, and each patrol brought renewed anxiety. Even those with decades of experience in the area admitted the experience had unsettled their perception of the river. Biologists and forensic analysts alike conceded that no native species, alone or in combination, could replicate the injuries or the sheer force observed in the encounter. Reports submitted to state wildlife agencies confirmed that the river's documented fauna could inflict only minor scratches or bruises, not fractures and deep punctures. Specialists acknowledged that while many predators have evolved hunting adaptations, nothing in the Red River ecosystem matched the evidence left behind, leaving the incident classified as an unresolved anomaly. Local residents and nearby farmers who rely on the river for irrigation began to report subtle anomalies, unexplained splashes in shallow pools, sudden shifts in bird and fish behaviour, and the occasional fleeting shadow at night. While no one could explain these occurrences, they added to the aura of mystery surrounding the stretch of river where the assault occurred. Patrol officers remained alert, and the story of the attack quietly circulated among those who knew the terrain best, reinforcing a collective sense of caution and unease. By dawn, the river appeared ordinary once more, its quiet surface masking the violent episode that had unfolded just hours before, leaving an invisible imprint on those who had witnessed it. Mist rose from the shallow stretches, swirling over sandbars and reeds, and the first light revealed nothing extraordinary, as if the river's calm had swallowed the memory of what had occurred. Patrols resumed, locals fished cautiously, and the river flowed on, indifferent to the questions it had provoked. Even decades later, the Red River border assault continues to haunt those who patrol its waters and banks, a stark reminder that the familiar can become perilous in an instant. Officers recount the night with careful precision, describing the ways the river seemed alive in the darkness, how currents shifted without reason, and how shadows danced in corners where no one could stand. Local residents who rely on the river for irrigation or recreation speak in hushed tones about sudden splashes or ripples that appear without cause, as if the river itself is conscious of its boundaries and those who cross them. Investigators who reviewed reports note that no documented predator or natural phenomenon could explain the injuries, yet the evidence remains vivid in the memories of those present. Over time, the story has woven itself into the local consciousness, a tale whispered along banks remembered in patrol logs and recounted in moments of quiet unease. Something lingered beneath the Red River's surface, silent yet deliberate, as if the waters themselves had adopted a secret, waiting for the next intruder to test its strength. The Arkansas River Night Crossing. Fog clung to the surface of the Arkansas River, curling around unseen bends and turning familiar banks into shapes that seemed to move with every step, as a small group prepared to cross the water under the cover of darkness. The river, flowing wide and slow in this region, was deceptively calm, its dark waters concealing shifting depths and hidden sandbars that had claimed inexperienced travellers before. The night air carried the faint scent of damp soil, decaying vegetation, and the occasional metallic tang of iron-rich silt. Cicadas hummed from the banks, and the low rustle of leaves made each step feel uncertain, as if the land itself was conspiring to mask the river's true nature. The travellers, unaware of the danger waiting beneath the surface, stepped carefully, lanterns casting flickering light that danced across the murky water. Lanterns cast trembling circles of light on tangled ropes and wooden planks as the travellers checked their gear, each movement deliberate, each glance toward the river weighed with caution. Among the group were local guides familiar with shallow crossings, and a few surveyors documenting the river's course, their experience meant to mitigate risk, yet the sense of unease was undeniable. Some adjusted life jackets, others tested the water with long poles, and the quiet murmurs of conversation revealed nerves under control, yet ready to snap at the first sign of trouble. The current whispered past sandbars and submerged logs, carrying the faint sound of snapping twigs and distant wildlife, while the water's black sheen reflected nothing of the sky above. Small fish occasionally broke the surface, their silhouettes fleeting, yet even these movements seemed amplified in the near-silent night. Mist hung low, blurring the line between river and bank, and each movement caused ripples that spread in concentric circles, giving the impression that something beneath the surface was reacting. Occasional owl calls punctuated the night, but the rhythmic sound of water flowing past driftwood and rocks created a tension that was hard to shake. The river seemed alive in a way that went beyond its natural sounds, and the cool, humid night air pressed on their senses, heightening every caution. A sudden ripple against a cluster of reeds drew startled attention, as if something beneath the water's surface had paused to examine the approaching figures. The travellers froze, scanning the misty banks and the black water, yet all they saw were indistinct shapes shifting with the current. Their guides muttered reassurances about floating debris or beavers, but the instinctive tension was undeniable. A chill ran down their spines, heightened by the night's silence and the subtle suggestion that the river itself was not merely a backdrop, but an active presence in the crossing. The calm dissolved into chaos as the first body was struck with an unrelenting force, flung into the cold water, leaving the others scrambling for balance on the slippery riverbank. Yells echoed across the mist-laden surface as panic erupted. One traveller's leg was caught beneath a sudden surge, another was pulled nearly under before hands could grab hold. The water, dark and thick with sediment, seemed to resist rescue efforts, and the group realized that the impact had come from a force no ordinary predator or river hazard could produce. Hands gripped ropes and each other, shouts cut through the night, and the river seemed to mock their efforts with currents that twisted and pulled unpredictably. Lanterns swung wildly, throwing stark shadows across the fog, and each splash of water was amplified, producing a chaotic symphony of sound. One traveller felt the slick riverbed shift beneath their feet, sand giving way unexpectedly, while another struggled to hold a lantern steady against the tug of the current. The group struggled to maintain cohesion, calling to each other and tugging at those caught in the flow, yet the attack was precise, targeted, and fleeting, leaving no visible assailant and only confusion in its wake. When investigators returned to the site at dawn, only shallow footprints, scattered debris, and subtle water disturbances remained, betraying no sign of any natural predator capable of such calculated force. No drag marks suggested a struggle along the banks, and the riverbed showed nothing beyond the disturbance left by the group itself. Experts noted the lack of claw marks or bite patterns that could have been attributed to known species inhabiting the area. The river had erased its own traces, leaving the assault's details to be reconstructed only from the survivors' memories. The Arkansas River's shifting depths, hidden sandbars and occasional whirlpools are well-documented hazards, yet none could account for the precise, crushing impact delivered to the group. The river's wildlife, from catfish to raccoons, were incapable of exerting the force required to hurl human bodies or tear clothing. Logs and submerged snags, while dangerous, cannot selectively target a single person within a group. River charts and historical records confirm that nothing in this stretch could produce the injuries witnessed, making the event an anomaly in both natural and human terms. Survivors' accounts varied. A fleeting shadow darting across the water, a muffled splash where none should have occurred, and the unsettling feeling that the river itself was watching. Some described feeling tugged at by invisible hands, or sudden changes in the current that threatened to unbalance them. Others recalled moments of unnatural silence immediately before the strike, as if the water had stilled intentionally to focus on the approaching group. These recollections were consistent in their sense of deliberate unseen observation. Rescue boats cut through misty waters at first light, ferrying injured travellers to safety, while the river gradually returned to an ordinary calm that seemed to erase all evidence of violence. Emergency responders noted the lack of physical clues beyond the survivors themselves, and medical evaluations confirmed injuries consistent with extreme blunt force, yet lacking corresponding predator markings. Despite careful documentation and repeat visits to the site, no explanation reconciled the survivors' experiences with known environmental or wildlife factors. Biologists, hydrologists, and trauma specialists examined the scene and the injuries, concluding that no known species, alone or in combination, could have inflicted such force with surgical precision. The current and riverbed conditions were analysed in detail, ruling out whirlpools, debris, or sudden surges as causes. Specialists noted that while unusual river accidents happen, they almost always leave identifiable patterns, none of which matched this incident. The assault remained unclassified, a case in which the river itself seemed to defy understanding. Even after the river settled and survivors returned home, the memory of unseen movements and the strange pattern of attack lingered, as if the water itself remembered each struggle. The event was whispered among local communities and patrol teams, not as folklore, but as a cautionary account of a force entirely unpredictable. Nights along the Arkansas River were never approached with casual confidence again. Even those familiar with its treacherous bends and shifting currents approached its banks with an unspoken wariness. On nights when the current flows quietly, the Arkansas River seems to hold its breath, guarding secrets that only the darkness has ever witnessed. The Pearl River Swamp Struggle. Something had clearly struggled here. Torn branches, broken reeds, and footprints that ended abruptly in the mud, leaving the search team unsettled before they had even stepped fully into the maze of trees and roots. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint, pungent scent of decaying leaves and stagnant water, while the team's boots sank slightly into the soft earth with each careful step. Small, fleeting sounds, cracks of twigs, distant splashes, made the investigators pause repeatedly, straining to identify whether these were wildlife or echoes of the mysterious attack. The signs of violence were subtle yet unmistakable, and already the swamp seemed to press in around them with a presence they could neither see nor name. The investigators paused at the edge of the clearing, checking equipment and reviewing maps, while a sense of unease settled over them, heightened by the irregular impressions in the soft soil. Binoculars were raised and notepads opened as they began documenting every anomaly, knowing that careful observation was their only recourse in a terrain that defied standard scrutiny. Each step forward revealed more broken reeds, scattered debris, and tiny pools of mud that appeared disturbed in ways inconsistent with natural currents. Even the most seasoned members of the team exchanged wary glances, recognizing that the evidence hinted at an extraordinary level of force. Every careful step threatened to sink boots into hidden pockets of waterlogged earth, forcing the team to balance on roots and fallen logs as they pressed deeper toward the signs of the disturbance. Hanging vines and cypress knees made navigation treacherous, and the low light under the dense canopy required lanterns to trace safe paths. The swamp's ground seemed to shift beneath their weight, and occasional plops and gurgles of water hinted at the presence of submerged obstacles. Despite the physical difficulty, the team's focus remained on the marks of struggle, aware that any misstep might erase critical evidence or leave them vulnerable to hidden dangers. Fragments of clothing snagged on reeds, and small streaks of dried blood traced along the mud, suggesting that whoever, or whatever, had been here moved with a violence and precision no ordinary predator could achieve. The torn fabric indicated a rapid, chaotic confrontation, yet the distribution of debris seemed deliberate, almost calculated. Small claw or bite marks were absent, deepening the mystery. No known animal could inflict this kind of trauma and then vanish without trace. The investigators photographed each piece of evidence, careful to preserve context, while a growing sense of unease reminded them that the swamp itself was an unpredictable witness. One investigator knelt to examine the prints more closely, noting unusual depressions in the soil that indicated crushing weight, applied with deliberate intent, unlike the tracks left by deer or alligators. Measurements were taken, impressions traced, and angles recorded. Nothing aligned with any known wildlife behaviour. Some footprints suggested swift movement, others a sudden stop, as if the attacker had lifted, shifted, or struck with an intelligence that contradicted natural patterns. The sequence painted a story of violence that had occurred in near silence, leaving the team with more questions than answers. Thick layers of decaying leaves and submerged roots concealed shallow pools, making each step uncertain, while insects and the hum of distant frogs filled the oppressive silence with constant, almost tactile tension. Even experienced members of the group felt their senses heighten, every sound amplified, every shadow scrutinized. Occasionally, a splash or subtle shift in the water suggested movement just beyond reach, though nothing materialized. The swamp demanded attention, forcing the team to move carefully, as if every branch, root, and pool were deliberately testing their awareness. Birds that normally called at night were absent, frogs fell still, and small mammals seemed to retreat beyond the team's vision, as though the swamp itself had been disturbed by something unnatural. The absence of typical nocturnal activity amplified the unease, giving the impression that an invisible presence lingered. Even insects, usually indifferent to human observers, seemed subdued in certain sections, leaving stretches of the marsh strangely quiet. The team began to notice patterns in the silence itself, pockets of unnatural stillness that suggested awareness rather than randomness. Whispers passed between team members as they gestured to broken branches and snapped vines, some attempting rational explanations while others could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. The human element became another lens through which the swamp's mysteries were interpreted. Fear, curiosity, and logic each pulled in different directions. Some members suggested water currents or falling debris, while others recalled local tales of unexplained encounters along the Pearl River. No one could account fully for the combination of precision, force, and stealth implied by the evidence. Closer inspection revealed a sequence of force. Marks in mud and vegetation suggested targeted blows, dragging and lifting, all executed with a strength and intent that defied conventional understanding. The injury patterns reported by survivors in earlier reports matched the scene, reinforcing the sense of a deliberate and almost intelligent attack. Nothing in the team's combined experience or the known wildlife of the area could replicate the observations, leaving the phenomenon firmly outside conventional explanations. Every mark told a story, yet that story remained frustratingly incomplete. The Pearl River swamps have long been remote and difficult to traverse, and local records contain occasional reports of disappearances and unexplained disturbances that mirror the pattern the team now observed. Historical surveys noted sudden vanishings of travellers or hunters, sometimes leaving only fragments of clothing or fleeting signs of struggle. While folklore may have embellished some accounts, the patterns were consistent. Something powerful and unseen had struck in silence, leaving no predictable traces. The modern investigation only added weight to these older, verified records. Even as the team prepared to retreat, subtle disturbances, a ripple in stagnant water, a barely audible snap of a branch, reminded them that the swamp retained the memory of what had occurred here. Their senses were taut with vigilance, scanning every shadow and listening to every shift in the environment. Noises that would normally pass unnoticed now carried significance. a displaced leaf, a sliding stone, the brush of a vine against a boot. It was as if the swamp itself was aware of their presence and willing to test their attention at every step. By the time the team returned to solid ground, the signs of struggle had faded under the weight of mud and foliage. Yet the knowledge of deliberate, incomprehensible force remained vivid in their minds. Reports were filed, photographs catalogued, and maps annotated, but no analysis could fully account for the events or the evidence. Even after leaving the swamp, the investigators felt the lingering weight of a force they could neither see nor measure, an unsettling certainty that some mysteries were designed to resist explanation. Even as the sun rose, the swamp seemed to pulse with the memory of what had occurred, leaving an unease that no explanation could fully dissolve. The Savannah River ferry landing attack. Shouts cut through the morning air at the ferry landing, startling those nearby as a sudden and inexplicable assault left victims in confusion and terror. Wooden benches had been overturned, ropes were twisted across the planks, and scattered cargo suggested a force moving with unexpected precision and power. Commuters froze in place, unsure whether to help the injured or flee from a danger they could not see. The suddenness of the attack left no time to analyse, only the raw awareness that something extraordinary had occurred in the middle of a familiar heavily travelled dock. Sunlight glanced off wet wooden planks glinting on ropes, cleats, and the ferry's metal hardware, while the river flowed quietly beneath the familiar rhythm of daily crossings. The main dock stretched nearly 200 feet across the riverbank, its timber worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the ferry itself had a capacity for over a dozen passengers at a time. Early morning mist hovered low over the water, catching the first rays of sun and painting the landing in muted gold and silver. Despite the ordinary calm of the river and surrounding trees, the scene on the dock was chaotic. Personal items were strewn across boards, footprints in mud led nowhere, and the unsettling absence of any visible assailant made the moment surreal. Commuters stepping onto the dock froze at the sight of overturned benches and scattered cargo, their usual routines shattered by a force no one could identify. Voices trembled as individuals called out for help, their words colliding with screams of surprise or pain. Children clung to parents, their small hands gripping tightly as the adults tried to make sense of the scene. The sudden attack disrupted the familiar sequence of ferry arrivals and departures, leaving a momentary void where nothing seemed to follow the normal rhythm of life along the river. Footprints in the mud led to no discernible point of entry, and scuff marks suggested a rapid, almost surgical application of strength that defied explanation. A few crates of supplies had toppled into shallow water, their contents, rope, tools and barrels of fish, scattered in patterns that hinted at sudden upheaval rather than clumsy handling. Some prints were unusually deep, indicating weight or force far beyond that of a human body, while the spacing between them implied sudden, deliberate movement. Authorities quickly noted the irregularity of the marks. No known animal of the region could produce such impressions, and the absence of claw or bite patterns further deepened the mystery. Evidence of struggle existed, but its source remained invisible. Cuts and contusions on several victims hinted at precise, deliberate strikes rather than accidents, baffling medics and first responders alike. Bruises suggested crushing strength applied in unusual angles, and lacerations appeared with a sharpness inconsistent with falling objects or river debris. No witnesses saw a weapon, claw or hand make contact, leaving the pattern of injuries wholly anomalous. Medics reported that some wounds appeared as though compressed with a flat, heavy surface, a form of trauma uncommon in accidental falls or minor collisions. Medical personnel worked quickly to stabilize the injured, all while exchanging glances that conveyed the same unspoken thought. Something unexplainable had occurred here. Voices trembled as onlookers recounted what they had seen, a mixture of disbelief, fear, and instinctive attempts to rationalize a scene that made no sense. Some described sudden movement at the edge of vision, a blur disappearing into the shadows of trees lining the landing. Others swore that the attack seemed almost calculated, as if someone or something had observed them before striking. Even the most logical individuals struggled to maintain composure in the face of an event that challenged ordinary understanding of force and speed. Several witnesses mentioned hearing faint splashes in the river, though no boat or visible intruder could account for the disturbance. Currents and tides remained steady, and no debris from upstream could account for the sudden chaos, leaving the river itself an unyielding enigma. The Savannah River, typically 1,500 to 2,000 feet wide at this point, flowed steadily with a moderate current, making it unlikely that drifting objects or natural forces could produce the localized upheaval witnessed on the dock. Ferries, accustomed to navigating these waters daily, moved predictably, yet the violent disturbance on the dock did not align with any conceivable natural cause. Investigators considered wind, water movement, and even sudden boat impacts, but all failed to explain the pattern and location of injuries, marks, and displaced objects. The water remained calm, indifferent to the extraordinary event that had briefly erupted on its edge. Notes were taken, sketches drawn, and photographs captured by authorities trying to piece together the sequence of events that unfolded in mere moments. Police reports emphasized the unusual strength implied by the marks, the abrupt disappearance of the force after the attack, and the absence of conventional clues. Witnesses were interviewed multiple times, yet the accounts often conflicted, with perceptions coloured by fear and shock. Investigators carefully recorded everything from the precise location of overturned cargo to subtle scuff marks on the dock, aware that even the smallest detail might offer a clue to a phenomenon that defied logic. Stories from older residents recalled past accidents and occasional disappearances, but nothing in the ferry's long history matched the precision or violence of this occurrence. Local historians noted that while the Savannah River had long been a site of trade, travel, and occasional mishaps, the nature of this attack was singular, deliberate, sudden, and unexplained. Archival records mentioned minor collisions, overturned boats, and isolated injuries, but never an event where the forces at play seemed to exceed human or animal capabilities. This historical context only intensified the sense of anomaly surrounding the day's incident, reinforcing the notion that something truly extraordinary had occurred. Details differed from one witness to another. Fear clouded memory, and the mind filled in blanks that only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the attack. Some remembered shadows moving too quickly to follow, while others recalled the peculiar sensation of a sudden weight or pressure along the dock. A few witnesses swore that the wooden planks had vibrated under unseen force, creating a sensation unlike any natural tremor. The discrepancies did not undermine the reality of the attack, but instead emphasized its inexplicable nature, as ordinary observation could not reconcile the available evidence. Quiet returned to the landing in the following days, yet an invisible weight hung over the place, as though the memory of the assault had imprinted itself on the dock. Ferry schedules resumed, cargo was loaded and unloaded, and commuters moved once again along the planks, but an underlying tension persisted. Conversations among workers and locals included careful mentions of the attack, often spoken in hushed tones. The dock, though structurally unchanged, seemed charged with the knowledge of the incident, and a subtle unease lingered for those crossing the ferry in early morning light. Officials and locals alike struggled to reconcile what had happened, acknowledging that some events may leave questions with no conceivable answers. Investigators compiled reports, photographs, and witness statements, yet no explanation satisfied the evidence. Local authorities could only recommend caution and awareness, emphasizing that while no immediate danger remained, the anomaly of the attack defied conventional logic. For those who had been present, and for the community that depended on the ferry, the event lingered as a quiet, unresolved tension that refused to dissipate, a story that would be recounted for years to come. Routine resumed along the Savannah River, yet the memory of that day persisted, an unanswered riddle beneath the calm waters and familiar crossings. The Columbia River Shoreline Assault. A lone kayaker glided along the Columbia River, unaware that the calm morning waters would soon erupt into a moment of inexplicable violence that defied understanding. The rhythm of paddle strokes echoed softly against the steep banks, and the usual quiet of early river traffic offered a false sense of security. For miles, the river stretched in uninterrupted breadth, a place familiar to local anglers, kayakers, and wildlife observers alike, yet on this day, familiarity proved no safeguard. What followed would leave behind a trail of injuries, damage, and unanswered questions that no one could fully explain. Jagged rocks jutted from the shoreline, reeds swayed in the mild current, and sunlight danced across the broad expanse of water, masking the sudden danger that lurked unseen. Small islands of driftwood floated downstream, creating eddies along the banks, while occasional sandbars and tiny inlets offered brief havens for birds and small mammals. Cliffs rose sharply in some sections, casting shadows that shifted with the morning sun, and the water itself reflected patterns that constantly changed with the gentle wind. Despite the outward calm, the river seemed to vibrate with a subtle tension, a prelude to the extraordinary events about to unfold. Birds scattered along the banks and the occasional fish broke the surface, creating ordinary ripples that offered no warning of the extraordinary force about to strike. Ducks paddled among the reeds, gulls wheeled overhead, and the soft murmur of wind through the trees provided a background of calm normalcy. The kayaker paused to observe a heron take flight, a gesture so ordinary it contrasted sharply with the sudden chaos that would soon erupt. Even the subtle movements of the water, glinting in sunlit streaks, seemed to hint at activity too faint for casual observation. Small splashes and abrupt shifts in the water's surface hinted at movement just beyond perception, a disturbance too deliberate to be caused by wind or wildlife. Shadows darted along the edge of vision, fleeting and untraceable as if something watched from beneath the surface. The kayaker noted tiny eddies forming inexplicably near rocks and fallen trees, and even the birds appeared momentarily startled, their cries slicing through the morning stillness. It was a tension without explanation, a warning that went unheeded until it erupted with overwhelming intensity. The kayaker felt a violent, concentrated impact that rocked the vessel, tossing gear and limbs in directions impossible to control, yet saw nothing approaching from any angle. The paddle was ripped from his grasp, rolling into the swirling current, and the kayak tilted sharply under the pressure of invisible force. Equipment scattered across the deck, a waterproof bag of supplies floated briefly before being swept away, and the kayaker's body lurched violently as if gripped by a hidden hand. The suddenness of the attack left no time for thought or reaction, only the raw awareness of a presence beyond comprehension. Disoriented and gripping the paddle for stability, the victim struggled to assess the origin of the assault, finding only the river's steady flow and empty space around the kayak. Panic coursed through the body as instinct collided with disbelief. Hands scrabbled for support, trying to regain balance, yet each movement was met with resistance and confusion, the water itself seeming to conspire against perception. The kayaker's eyes scanned every ripple, shadow and reflection, noticing subtle disturbances in the current, yet locating nothing that could explain the extraordinary strike. The kayaker's hands burned from the strain of gripping the paddle, and every movement against the Columbia's wide, unrelenting current became a struggle against both the water and mounting fear. The vessel's slender design, optimal for maneuvering but fragile under sudden force, creaked ominously as the impact reverberated through the frame. Glancing at the riverbank, the kayaker noticed scuffed rocks and displaced vegetation that suggested a rapid collision had occurred just out of view. Yet no pattern emerged to explain the source. Every instinct screamed that the assault had been deliberate, precise, and impossible to attribute to natural causes, reinforcing the unnerving awareness that the attack came from an entity or force entirely unseen. Logs and debris carried by the current threatened to capsize the small craft, forcing rapid maneuvers that offered no opportunity to identify what had caused the initial strike. A floating branch caught the bow, scraping its surface and adding to the sense of instability. Rocks near the shoreline created sudden eddies, and occasional submerged boulders jolted the kayak unpredictably. Each movement required intense concentration, and the kayaker's muscles burned from fighting the river's force while simultaneously attempting to evade an assailant that remained completely unseen. Bruises and cuts appeared on the kayaker's arms and torso, while the vessel itself bore deep gouges along its hull, none of which matched typical accident patterns or predator attacks. Examination later revealed patterns inconsistent with collisions or falls. Edges of the kayak were marked in precise lines, and the cuts suggested concentrated force applied with unusual angles. Medics reported that the injuries implied a combination of weight, speed, and control beyond normal human capability. The physical evidence reinforced what the witness already felt. The attack was deliberate, sudden, and inexplicable. Downstream, a fisherman noticed sudden ripples and frantic motion in the water, but by the time he reached the spot, all that remained was a swaying kayak and silence. He scanned the river for signs of the attacker, floating debris, wildlife fleeing, anything, but found nothing. The scene appeared ordinary at a glance, yet the kayaker's erratic movement and visible injuries told a different story. Observers later recalled the dissonance between the river's placid surface and the intensity of unseen force, emphasizing how quickly ordinary spaces could harbor inexplicable events. Authorities surveyed the shoreline, measured the current, and examined the kayak for clues, yet every observation confirmed that no conventional human or animal could have executed the assault. Reports highlighted the lack of identifiable entry points, the precision of injuries, and the unusual water displacement observed by witnesses. Investigators noted that currents, wind patterns, and river flow could not account for the localized nature of the attack. Every conventional explanation failed, leaving behind the stark reality that the incident defied known laws of physics and biology in this region. Kayakers and local river users recounted the incident with lingering tension, describing hesitation to return to familiar stretches of the river and the uneasy awareness that an unseen threat could strike at any time. Canoeists reported scanning the water more carefully, maintaining distance from the shoreline and avoiding early morning trips alone. A subtle anxiety settled over the community, a reminder that even rivers they had navigated for decades could conceal inexplicable forces. Many admitted to quietly warning newcomers about this stretch of the Columbia, whispering the story as if caution alone could prevent another encounter. Experts puzzled over how a precise, sudden and untraceable force could occur on such a broad and open river, acknowledging that some mysteries resist even the most careful analysis. Hydrologists, river guides, and local historians examined every detail, from water flow to injury patterns, yet all returned with the same unsatisfying conclusion. The Columbia River had delivered an event for which no rational explanation existed. Reflection alone could not account for the unseen power or the exactitude of the strike, leaving both experts and witnesses to confront uncertainty in its rawest form. The Columbia River flowed onward, placid and seemingly ordinary, yet the memory of that morning lingered like a shadow, just beneath its surface, unseen but impossible to forget. The Chattahoochee River disappearance. Moss-draped trees leaned over the Chattahoochee, their roots sinking into muddy banks as the river carried leaves and small debris downstream in ceaseless motion, hiding currents that shifted unpredictably beneath the surface. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the water with fleeting patterns that betrayed nothing of the strange forces lying in wait below. Anglers and kayakers who frequented this stretch often noted the river's deceptive calm, but on this day, that tranquility would conceal an event so inexplicable that no witness could fully account for it. Only later would the stark absence of one swimmer signal the mystery that had quietly unfolded. Sunlight dappled the water, glinting off ripples that danced across submerged rocks and branches, while shadows stretched along the banks, hinting at depth and hidden obstacles beyond the casual eye. Tiny eddies swirled near sunken logs, and scattered debris created deceptive currents that could mislead even the most practiced swimmer. Along the banks, clusters of reeds shivered in the gentle breeze, masking the subtle movements of fish and small aquatic animals that went unnoticed by passers-by. Every element of this familiar river seemed ordinary, yet the undercurrent of tension was palpable, as if the river itself had begun to shift in anticipation. The river's gentle murmur was interrupted by occasional irregular eddies and swirling patterns, signs of unseen disturbances that hinted at forces moving beneath the surface. From the shoreline, the water appeared unremarkable, yet a keen observer might notice that certain currents converged or diverged without apparent cause. Birds seemed to hesitate before landing, and even the faint rustle of leaves on the banks felt momentarily out of place. It was as if the river's flow was subtly altered by something invisible, something that had yet to make itself fully known. Fish darted in jerky, erratic patterns, and a flock of startled ducks lifted into the air as if sensing something imperceptible. Yet no wind or predator seemed to justify their sudden flight. The water shimmered unnaturally in places, reflecting sunlight at odd angles, and tiny whirlpools formed in patches where currents should have remained smooth. The unsettling phenomena were slight, almost negligible, but collectively they suggested that something beyond normal observation was moving within the river, something that would soon manifest in an unmistakable and alarming way. Ripples converged in a tight circle near a submerged branch, and currents appeared to pull at the water in ways that defied ordinary explanation, marking the instant when the swimmer would vanish from sight. Limbs kicked against the flowing water, yet the rhythm seemed disrupted by invisible resistance. Every stroke brought the sensation of tugging, yet no physical object or obstruction could be identified. The sudden disappearance occurred in a fraction of moments, leaving companions and witnesses shocked into silence, trying to reconcile the ordinary river with the extraordinary event. Shouts echoed across the riverbank as companions and bystanders scrambled to locate the missing individual. But the water offered only turbulence, shifting debris, and an unsettling emptiness where a body had been. Boats were launched hastily, hands searched the edges of reeds, and eyes scanned every shadow, but the river revealed no explanation. The tension of disbelief hung in the air as panic mingled with confusion. No one could explain how a swimmer, so visible just moments before, could simply vanish without trace in such a wide, open stretch of water. Emergency crews deployed boats, scanning the shoreline and probing inlets with poles and nets, yet the river, broad and deep, revealed no sign of a struggle or any physical explanation for the sudden disappearance. Searchers waded cautiously into shallow areas, noting submerged branches and rocks that could trip a swimmer, yet these obstacles could not account for the total absence of a person. The river's flow was consistent with local hydrology, and yet none of the measurements or observations provided answers. Even seasoned responders acknowledged the unnerving possibility that conventional reasoning might not suffice. Near a small bend, a lone shoe floated against a cluster of reeds, and a tangle of goggles snagged on a branch, the only tangible traces of an event that had occurred within a vast expanse of otherwise unbroken water. These items seemed almost deliberately placed by chance, yet their presence suggested abrupt removal rather than gradual loss. No other personal belongings were discovered downstream, and the riverbed offered no clues, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest a struggle. Each object raised more questions than it answered, highlighting the sheer strangeness of the disappearance. Locals who had frequented the river for years recalled other fleeting, unexplained sensations in these waters, whispering of currents that seemed to move with intelligence, shifting unpredictably beneath unsuspecting swimmers. Stories emerged of sudden cold pockets, unaccountable tugs, and objects moving against the current, all fleeting and often dismissed, yet collectively forming a subtle history of river anomalies. While some dismissed these accounts as superstition or exaggeration, the recent disappearance gave the tales newfound weight, suggesting the river occasionally harboured forces unseen by human eyes. Hydrologists, river guides, and law enforcement studied flow patterns, submerged obstacles, and river behaviour, concluding that neither water movement nor aquatic wildlife could account for the disappearance. Measurements of current velocity, depth, and temperature gradients matched historical norms, and local predator populations were well documented and incapable of inflicting such an event. The lack of physical evidence combined with witness reports left experts with an unsettling truth. The river had claimed a swimmer under circumstances that defied all rational explanation. By evening, the river's surface had returned to calm, yet the ripples and eddies retained a memory of the encounter, a subtle tension that could still be felt by anyone who paused to study the water closely. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the river's wide expanse, and nocturnal creatures emerged, adding to the sense of quiet unease. Even as searchers packed away equipment and returned home, the river seemed to whisper reminders of the unexplainable, hinting that some mysteries could not be fully illuminated no matter how carefully observed. Several days passed. Forensic divers returned to sections of the river, noting subtle changes in sediment and vegetation that seemed impossible to explain naturally. Rocks along the shoreline were scuffed as if something had been dragged, yet no discernible tracks or debris aligned with the disappearance. Water tests revealed nothing unusual in chemical composition or temperature, and sonar scans of the riverbed showed only the familiar contours of sandbars and submerged branches. Yet every search and measurement underscored the impossibility of the event. A person had vanished from a well-charted stretch of water, leaving behind only minor, unexplained disturbances that seemed to mock the certainty of human understanding. The Chattahoochee continued its slow journey through Georgia and Alabama, carrying silt and leaves as it had for centuries, yet beneath the placid exterior, the unanswered questions of that day persisted, hidden from view. Even the most familiar stretches now felt unpredictable, imbued with an intangible presence that left locals wary. Swimmers, kayakers, and river guides all approached with newfound caution, haunted by the knowledge that ordinary waters could conceal extraordinary phenomena. No trace of the swimmer was ever recovered, and the river, vast and indifferent, seemed to claim the event entirely, leaving only uncertainty in its wake. The Des Moines River Riverside Attack. The Des Moines River flowed quietly past concrete embankments and worn walking trails, its surface shimmering under the late morning sun as if concealing something just beyond perception. Trees leaned over the banks, their leaves brushing the water and scattering small ripples, while the distant hum of traffic mingled with birdsong. On a day that began as ordinary as any other, the river would witness an event that left observers confounded, a brief encounter of inexplicable violence that would be recorded in reports yet never fully understood. Those who frequented the riverside had no reason to suspect that danger lingered so invisibly along this familiar path. Joggers passed in steady rhythm, dogs tugged at leashes, and fishermen cast lines into eddies, all unaware that a brief moment of violence was about to erupt along the familiar riverbank. The benches and paved paths were well used, and trash bins lined the walkways, bearing the marks of decades of care by local authorities. The river, usually a source of calm and recreation, now seemed to thrum with quiet tension, as though the water itself had begun to anticipate the extraordinary. Every normal sound, the slap of running shoes on concrete, the bark of a dog, the ripple of a line cast into the river, contrasted sharply with the invisible threat gathering nearby. Small stones had been displaced along the river's edge, and the faint scent of disturbed soil lingered in the air, unnoticed by passers-by, yet hinting at an unrecorded struggle. Tiny scratches on roots and saplings suggested a sudden tug, almost imperceptible yet inconsistent with the ordinary flow of wildlife activity. The surface of the river appeared undisturbed, yet the patterns of mud and sand along the bank betrayed subtle disturbances. For those attuned to the rhythms of the river, these were clues, small, almost dismissible, but the first hints that something entirely unaccountable had already occurred. A sudden scream cut through the hum of morning activity, drawing startled glances as the river seemed to erupt with unseen force, leaving a lone jogger reeling from injuries that no one could immediately explain. The sounds of sneakers skidding on damp gravel and an abrupt splash of water mingled with cries for help, creating a chaotic overlay against the otherwise serene riverside. Eyewitnesses described fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows that seemed to defy ordinary speed, and a sensation of violent disruption that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. In an instant, the tranquil riverside transformed into a scene of inexplicable chaos. Footprints in the damp mud were oddly angled and interrupted, and the jogger's torn clothing suggested a strength and precision impossible to attribute to local wildlife. Gravel had been displaced in arcs inconsistent with a simple stumble, and impressions on the bank were neither uniform nor random, hinting at an external force that applied sudden, targeted pressure. No teeth marks, no claw impressions, nothing in the region's documented fauna could account for the injuries observed. Even the most experienced investigators struggled to reconcile what was physically present with any known cause. Nearby pedestrians froze, some rushing forward while others gawked in disbelief, recounting the attack in fragmented whispers, unable to reconcile what they had seen with the ordinary flow of the riverside. One cyclist recounted the scene of a body jostled violently, yet with no visible assailant, while a father shielding his child described the water rippling unnaturally, as if responding to an invisible presence. Eyewitness accounts varied in detail but were unanimous in describing the impossibility of what had occurred, and their voices trembled with the lingering shock of confrontation with the unknown. Law enforcement officers cordoned off the area, meticulously photographing disturbed vegetation and examining the ground for impressions, yet every clue seemed to contradict known patterns of animal or human behaviour. Police noted scuffed patches along the walkway and indentations along the bank that ended abruptly, with no signs of drag marks or escape routes. The river itself appeared calm, yet officers could not dismiss the subtle anomalies in the sand and gravel, which suggested sudden, deliberate interaction with the environment in a manner inconsistent with ordinary accidents. Medical personnel and investigators analysed the jogger's injuries, noting extreme force applied in a precise manner, leaving marks inconsistent with falls, collisions, or predatory attacks documented in the region. Bruising patterns suggested an impact from multiple angles, yet no tool or natural hazard could account for the distinctive contours of the wounds. Emergency responders remarked on the unusual clarity of the injuries. Each appeared purposeful, almost as if designed to incapacitate without leaving excess evidence. In forensic terms, the event defied explanation. Residents who regularly walked or fished along this stretch of the Des Moines River began sharing tales of minor disturbances, brushes with unseen currents, and fleeting sensations that now seemed connected to the inexplicable assault. Some recalled sudden gusts of wind without cause, others spoke of water surges that nudged canoes or overturned small boats. Previously dismissed as anomalies, these stories gained new relevance, suggesting that the river occasionally concealed phenomena beyond human comprehension, patiently awaiting the moment to manifest in more serious incidents. Longtime river guides recalled earlier incidents of mysterious injuries and sudden panic along the riverside, suggesting that the location had a history of unaccountable encounters dating back decades. From old fishing logs to local newspaper mentions of strange river mishaps, patterns emerged that hinted at a persistent, though largely invisible, force. Guides described areas where sudden turbulence and unusual sounds seemed concentrated, and in retrospect these recollections added a chilling dimension to the day's unexplainable attack. Despite careful mapping of the riverbank and repeated analysis of every footprint and mark, investigators returned with more questions than answers, the scene giving nothing more than a lingering sense of incomprehensible force. Debris had been shifted, vegetation disturbed, and the joggers' clothing torn, yet no tangible assailant was ever identified. Experts admitted that conventional methods could not reconcile the evidence with reality, leaving the river as a locus of uncertainty, a place where ordinary life collided with forces that resisted explanation. Even as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over benches and trail markers, the river resumed its steady course, sunlight glinting off the water as if nothing had occurred. The jogger recovered physically but remained haunted by the memory, while neighbours and witnesses regarded the riverside with a quiet wariness. What appeared normal to casual observers was now layered with invisible tension, a persistent reminder that the Des Moines River could host events beyond human understanding at any moment. There's no explanation that ever reconciled the physical evidence with the known wildlife and environmental conditions, leaving the Des Moines River's riverside as a quiet stage for a violence that defies reason.